Chapter 311. On the other side of the cafeteria, Angus Jeffrey cut the syrup cake on his plate with great effort. His brows furrowed the entire time. He was in a very bad mood at the moment. Mike Owen did go to duel with Dake Dimung. Although the result of the duel wasn't particularly ideal, it was still within his acceptable range. But why did he have an indescribable strange feeling? It was as if everything he had done before was in vain. As a core member of the Aristocratic History Research Society, Mike Owen's actions should have been blamed on the Aristocratic History Research Society. This would create the impression that the Aristocratic History Research Society and Dake Dimung were opposing each other. But in reality? Memorize in 1 second https://m. VIP can't you? VIP Jeffrey's mind recalled Dake's last words to Owen. Senior, take care. He suddenly had the urge to vomit blood. Why did the duel just now seem like a friendly duel between a senior and a junior? Owen had even specially chosen the more dangerous street duel mode. But why was the final result like this? After a long while, Jeffrey finally came to a conclusion. The problem must be with Mike Owen. The darkness of dusk gradually spread from the horizon and flowed into the orange-red sunset. A thin layer of gauze covered the snow. While Dake was taking care of the magic elves, he was also eating at the same table with the girls. Senior Panduola was surprisingly reserved in front of so many people. She was clearly a big eater who loved to eat meat, but tonight she always stopped at a certain point. Professor Li was the complete opposite. She had been releasing her nature to her heart's content since she started in the snow. Deanna was much more restrained in front of the professor, but sometimes she still couldn't help but compete with her for desserts. Luosi was as quiet as ever. However, she secretly noticed that Panduola's familiar seemed to have extra spirituality. They sat together. It didn't seem like a Valentine's Day dinner, but more like a family dinner. Professor Li and Deanna didn't have much of a reaction. However, Panduola and Luosi seemed to enjoy the atmosphere of this family dinner very much. At 6:30 p.m., Panduola looked at the time and said, "It's getting late, I have to go. It's been a great day. Thank you all." "You're leaving so soon?" Professor Li said. "I want to continue tonight." Dake couldn't help but sigh. "Professor, we still have classes tonight." "Huh?" Professor Li was surprised. "Is that so? Maybe my brain automatically blocked out this part of the memory." She couldn't help but reveal a regretful expression. She couldn't remember how long it had been since the last time she had experienced such happiness. The professors in the academy were too serious. None of them even dared to roll around in the snow. Then Professor Li, "I'll take my leave first. Goodbye, everyone." Panduola waved at Dake and left the cafeteria. Then Dake and the others began to pack up. The magic elves put small forks, spoons, and other things on their plates and carried the plates directly to the kitchen. Dake cleaned up the table a little and went into the kitchen to thank the halfling chefs. Then the whole family left the cafeteria. Although Professor Li's face was full of regret, he had to say goodbye to Dake and the others at the fork in the road to the professor's dormitory. In the end, only Dake's group of 3 was left. "It's time for class again." Deanna pouted and muttered, "I'm quite interested in the astronomy class at night," Luosi said with a smile. Then, the two of them played around in the spacious corridor. The dim yellow light slanted in from the windows of the castle. The 3 of them walked into the light and sank into the darkness, moving forward in the intertwining light and darkness. After entering the tower and returning to the dormitory, Dake suddenly found a few chocolates at his door. He bent down and picked up the chocolates one by one. He thought that it wasn't good to eat too much of these sweet things, but he still carried them through the door. Using the last bit of free time before class, Dake opened the chocolates one by one. Some of the chocolates had cards and letters with names written on them, but some were just plain chocolates, as if they were too embarrassed to leave their names. In general, the people who gave him chocolates were the same group of people, but there were a few more first-year students outside of the Noble Academy. He put away the cards, letters, and other things, and then put the chocolates to the side. Although he was embarrassed, he couldn't eat all the chocolates, so he could only let the magic elves share the burden. In the end, only the chocolates given by Professor Li, Panduola, and Luosi were left. He thought about it and decided to keep it as a reserved program and open it at night. There were always some surprises in life. Sometimes they were encountered. Sometimes they needed to be created by themselves. Come here for a moment. Dake waved at little Ibu. Ibu, who had already put her little bag around her neck, jumped into his arms like a frog. Dake recalled a move from a certain anime and tried to put little Ibu on his shoulder. But little Ibu, who weighed 13 kilograms, was a bit heavy. In the end, Dake chose to hold it in his arms. At this time, Paradise had already been reopened in the dormitory. After the magic elves played crazily for an entire afternoon, they were all satisfied and lying in various places in the dormitory, lazily doing their own things. But the gazes that secretly glanced at little Ibu were mixed with all kinds of envy. Every Wednesday night, Ibu would go out with such envious gazes. This was probably one of the main reasons why she continued to like astronomy class. Now that Professor Mitya Bartholomew had already agreed to let Dake bring little Ibu into the class, he didn't need to put it in his card. The road from the Noble Academy's tower to the spiral clock tower was a bit long, so Dake had to leave early. He met up with Luosi and Deanna in the common room, and went to the classroom together. On the way to the spiral clock tower, the voices of the first-year students gradually became softer and softer. Their minds gradually broke away from the atmosphere of Valentine's Day, and gradually returned to the mentality of a scholar. Everything was quietly changing. When they climbed the long spiral staircase and arrived at the astronomy classroom on the top floor of the spiral clock tower, the sound of panting replaced everything else. Apart from this flight of stairs that was called the spiral hell, there was nothing bad about astronomy class. It was inevitable that someone would be late for the 7:30 astronomy class tonight. But Professor Mitya, who was also late, seemed to lack the confidence to deduct points from them. The astronomy class on Valentine's Day began 3 minutes after the bell rang. As usual, Professor Mitya Bartholomew entered from the ceiling in a carriage. Tonight, she was wearing a very sensual witch outfit. The increasingly cold weather didn't seem to affect her at all. There wasn't even a snowflake on the pumpkin carriage. At night, snowflakes began to fall sporadically from the sky, exuding a faint aesthetic aura. Professor Mitya put away the carriage and put the pointed witch hat on the podium. She waved her thin wand and weaved a line of words in the air. "I love you all, Heartsuit." Then she smiled and said, "Today is Valentine's Day, ladies and gentlemen. Have you received chocolates from your sweetheart?" The classroom was cold and silent. Although the first-year students seemed to be following the trend, the communication between people was, after all, shallow. In fact, there weren't many people who really received something on Valentine's Day. Professor Mitya naturally saw through this at a glance. She was just teasing him in a bad way. Looking at the deflated expressions on the faces of most of the students, she was able to derive pleasure from it. While everyone was distressed by this, Professor Mitya changed the topic to the most desired topic of the students. During last week's astronomy class, I already had a prophecy. This year's Valentine's Day will be a sign of heavy snow. Snow is a bountiful year. Today is a suitable day for confessions. Those who have the courage to send chocolates today will have a higher probability of receiving a response from White and Green Day. As she spoke, she glanced at Dake's face. Dake's mind was moved. He stroked Ibuzachan's soft fur. He wondered if Professor Mitya was hinting that he would respond to every chocolate giver on White and Green Day. Please. Valentine's Day isn't Christmas. Even if it was him, he wouldn't be that despicable. But when this was mentioned, Dake was actually a bit worried. He could ignore other people's Valentine's Day chocolates, but he couldn't ignore their chocolates. The promotion of righteous chocolates in this world was still in its early stages. The importance of Valentine's Day chocolates was still relatively high. Giving chocolates back on White and Green Day would more or less cause some changes in relationships. Dake hadn't considered this before, but now he had to. Under the blessing of the first snow of winter, tonight's divination will be even more effective. I believe some of the students have already heard that tonight, our topic is a must-have for Valentine's Day, love divination. Professor Mitya waved her magic wand and drew a red heart in the air. Then she turned around and wrote, "Love divination" on the blackboard. After this line of words was written, The atmosphere in the classroom gradually turned pink. The atmosphere was filled with an ambiguous atmosphere. No, it really turned pink. The students looked up and saw a huge magic array appear on the ceiling. The pink light released from the magic array illuminated everyone's face. The pink light flickered. The atmosphere gradually blurred. Professor Mitya knocked on the podium and said, "The door of fate has been opened. The blessing of the goddess of love will guide us to the direction of love. Pick up your magic pens and inject your most sincere feelings into them. Then look at me and draw a magic array on the paper." She then turned around and drew an exquisite magic array on the blackboard with just one stroke. In the center of the magic array was a symbol that Dake was extremely familiar with. He only needed a glance to recognize that it was the astronomical symbol that symbolized the moon. When this symbol appeared, Dake, who was in the mood to entertain himself, immediately became serious. There was such a symbol in the bliss coat of arms. It seemed to represent the origin of bliss. "Professor, what kind of magic array is this?" Professor Mitya didn't seem to want to tell him the origin of the magic array. Dake couldn't help but raise his hand and ask. The corners of Professor Mitya's mouth curled up. "You can call it the love magic array. I excavated it in the ancient moon shrine. It will guide people on a moonlit night. Every Valentine's Day night is when the effect is at its greatest." Dake asked again, "May I ask, is the symbol in the center of the love magic array the symbol of the moon?" Professor Mitya smiled and nodded. She then looked at the other students. "Dake Dimming is right. That is the star symbol that symbolizes the moon. Every star has a corresponding star symbol. I will explain this part clearly in the next class, but not today." She meant that this was beyond the scope of the class, so shut up and don't ask. Dake opened his mouth and sat down helplessly. However, the information revealed by Professor Mitya was enough to clear his doubts. The astronomical symbols of this world indeed had extraordinary power. They should be similar to the key, to communicate with the stars, and they would frequently appear in the corresponding magic array. If he could deepen his understanding of this aspect, he might be able to find the research direction of the Great Sin Array. He gradually understood that after reaching the Great Sin Array, the differences between the sins would increase. The originally unified array wouldn't be enough to support the creation of the Great Sin Array. Perhaps each type of Great Sin pill needed to be refined into an independent formation. With this inspiration, he needed to spend more time accumulating the relevant knowledge. When he accumulated enough knowledge, success would follow naturally. Dake refocused his attention on the class. He spread out a piece of white paper on the table, took out a magic pen, and tried to inject sincere feelings into it. What was sincere feelings? It couldn't be friendship, right? That was the feeling of a lover. However, Dake didn't have a lover. If he had to find one, he admitted that he had a certain degree of affection for Panduola. However, before he injected sincere feelings, he turned his head and looked at little Ibu, who was sitting on the table. Ibu followed suit and spread out a piece of paper in front of it. However, it only had an ordinary pen in its hand. Dake wanted to give it a magic pen, but it had to know how to use it first. Don't force yourself to use the pen to draw. Think about the feeling of using a killing move. Try to guide your magic power to your fingertips. Ibu tilted its head. It was confused. Dake couldn't help but cover his head. "Let's use the pen first." Then he picked up the magic pen and slowly recalled his encounter with Panduola. Feelings gradually welled up in his heart. Under the guidance of magic power, they were injected into the magic pen. He began to quickly draw according to the magic array on the blackboard. When the completion of the magic circle of love reached 70%, a silk thread hung down from the huge magic circle that was rotating slowly on the ceiling and connected with it. Magic power began to circulate. 2 and 1 4200. I took a break on New Year's Day. The weather has been changing and I've been coughing. Everyone, take care of your health. Try to work towards the goal of 8K a day this month. Although you may not be able to do it, _. However, you have to set up a target first. Otherwise, where will you shoot after you raise your gun? Last but not least, I beg for monthly votes. Chapter 312. It was Valentine's Day night. The students' yearning for a beautiful relationship was at its peak. Therefore, when they held the pen, their feelings would naturally flow to the tip of the pen along with the magic power. The so-called sincere feelings were actually very broad. There was no need to have a partner. Even if it was just the thought of "what do you want?" it was enough. But Professor Midia said such a sentence at this time, in this atmosphere, it would naturally cause some misunderstandings. The students would rack their brains to think about who they liked. So when Dake sketched the magic array, he found that he had unknowingly become the center of attention. If it was calculated according to the number of chocolates received today, this gaze was too much. But thinking about it carefully, this might just be a product of comparison. Website: https://mvip can't you? VIP. After all, Dake Dimming was a little son. Professor Midia Bartholomew observed the students' every move from the podium. Her gaze swept over some people from time to time. Finally, she walked to Eudora's side and tapped the table lightly. Pa! Eudora jumped down suddenly. When she looked up, she saw Professor Midia's snickering face. She couldn't help but open her mouth, and her white cheeks were covered with red clouds. "Don't be fascinated," Professor Midia reminded. Eudora lowered her head and said, "Okay, teacher." Then she immediately began to sketch the magic array. Professor Midia then continued to walk forward. After walking to the last row, she touched little Ivan's head. Looking at the crooked magic array, she couldn't help but purse her lips. She held back her laughter, then looked at Dake, turned around lightly, and walked to the other side of the last row. White and Luoboat were also sketching the magic array. Luoboat thought for a long time, but there was only the shadow of the magic chess in his mind. White bit the pen shaft and thought of the peach. After the two saw the professor coming over, they quickly stopped the illusion, picked up the pen, and began to sketch. Very naturally, Midia stayed beside them for a while. Then she returned to the podium. The students dilly-dallied, but in the end they all picked up their pens. In short, regardless of whether the feelings were sincere or not, what should be drawn had to be drawn. As the magic arrays of love were completed, pink threads fell from the huge magic array that was rotating slowly on the ceiling, covering the entire classroom like a curtain of rain. The students curiously reached out to touch it, but when his fingers brushed past her, he didn't feel anything. Finally, someone could not help but raise his hand and ask. Professor Midia smiled and explained, "It's a type of astrology. You can think of it as the night sky, and the magic arrays you write are the stars. When the stars merge into the night sky, it becomes a starry sky." The students nodded as if they understood. Professor Midia raised her wand and lightly tapped the magic array on the ceiling. The magic array began to spin even faster. Gradually, no one was able to see the circuit of the magic array from the diagram. When he looked up, he could only see a galaxy of stars spinning above his head. The threads that fell down gradually turned transparent, and eventually turned into stars that adorned the starry sky vortex. The students couldn't help but hold their breaths when they saw this scene. Dake tried to use the magic array of love on the paper to sense it in reverse. But perhaps because he didn't have the gift of divination, he could only sense that there was magic power circulating in the starry sky vortex. He had no choice but to turn his gaze to little Ivan. But little Ivan was squatting on the table, using its two front paws to grab the paper with the crooked magic array drawn on it. But it was only looking at the starry sky above its head, because it looked at the entire classroom. Only its head didn't have any threads falling down. Dake couldn't bear to look anymore. He wanted to quickly teach the magic guide fairies how to sense and control magic power. At this moment, Professor Midia's voice sounded. The so-called love divination in astrology is concerned with the moon. With the moon as the center, you can see the mysteries of the movement of the stars. Then she closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there was a silver moon shining in her eyes. With the help of the eyes of the stars, Professor Midia's astrology skills would be greatly improved. But of course, she couldn't do a real divination for a single class. Although there were many astrological techniques that couldn't be used to see the future, they were still very similar to that. Professor Midia was using one of them. In this astronomy class, she mainly wanted the students to have a deeper understanding of astrology. It would be best if they could personally experience it. Valentine's Day's love divination was a good opportunity to cut in. She would use the magic array of love to guide the magic power of the students, so that they could jointly drive a small group of astrologers. For now, it seemed, the students of Shungmalian Academy could be considered qualified in terms of magic power. Not a single one of them fell behind. As the starry sky vortex on the ceiling continued to rotate, some people were able to see something from it, while others were just confused. But it had to be said that the starry sky vortex was quite fascinating. It was impossible to get tired of looking at it. A few minutes later, the vortex gradually slowed down. Then, beams of starlight shot down from the starry sky vortex, accurately landing on the magic array of love, one after another. Professor Midya said, "Look carefully. If you are lucky enough, you will be able to see the other half of the future from this magic array." The atmosphere in the classroom suddenly became restless. This was the charm of divination. There was no one who didn't want to know their future in advance. Although sometimes knowing the future wasn't a good thing. But at this moment, no one thought too much about it. Almost all the students focused their attention on the magic array of love that was illuminated by the starlight when Professor Midya announced it. Yai? Earbook looked at the beams of starlight that were as enchanting as a dream. He desperately raised the paper in his hand to catch it. But unfortunately, the beam of starlight that was closest to him didn't change direction. Instead, it directly landed on Dake's magic array of love. He couldn't help but turn his head to look at the paper that had the magic array drawn on it. Dake was carefully observing the magic array of love that was illuminated by the starlight according to Professor Midya's guidance. The fog that gradually rose from the magic array was hazy. It seemed that some vague figures could really be seen from it. Dake thought for a while, and suddenly felt that it was somewhat familiar. But he couldn't remember how he was familiar with it at the moment. He couldn't help but reveal a puzzled expression. As the astrology continued to operate, all the magic arrays on the students' desks started to rise with fog. The entire classroom seemed to be shrouded in fog. The students widened their eyes, trying to see something from the fog. Under their gaze, the fog gradually rolled, and there were many figures in it. Midya closed her eyes at this moment. Then in the starry sky vortex on the ceiling, a silver moon hung upside down, full and clear. Two eyes quietly opened behind the silver moon, overlooking the entire classroom. Every student's expression, every change in the magic array, the rolling of every cloud of fog. Nothing could be hidden from her eyes. It's here. Among all the students, Eudora's divination talent was undoubtedly the highest. She held her hands over her heart and looked at the fog nervously. She prayed that the other half of the fog would point to the person in her heart. Stars lit up in her eyes, and the fog was disturbed by her thoughts. Gradually, the figure hidden deep in the fog emerged on the surface. Her eyes became brighter and brighter. Midya, who was on the podium, couldn't help but sigh. Eudora's longing was obvious, as if it was engraved on her face. But even without divination, she could see that the path in Eudora's heart was not easy to walk. What was waiting for her might be a future that was more severe than what she thought. However, everything seemed to be destined when the two sides met. Just like the fate that the astrologer believed in the most. Eudora was a born astrologer. She had a natural obsession with fate. While thinking, Midya didn't withdraw her gaze. Her eyes of stars could let her see what others couldn't. The fog in front of Eudora, as expected, showed the figure of the blonde youth. It was a handsome face that seemed to have walked out of a fairy tale. It was the prince that girls always imagined when they read picture books at night. Dake Dimung, the son of stars. Woo! Eudora suddenly covered her mouth. Her cheeks were visibly rosy, and her whole body was trembling with excitement. Although she had a general understanding of the foundation of astrology after learning from Midya, and knew that the divination in front of her was not really predicting the future, she still felt sincerely happy about it. Dake's rejection had also confused her. The difficult math homework was also a blow to her, who wanted to be outstanding. The influence of her family environment made her not have much confidence in herself. Therefore, she needed to get some affirmation before she could go on with more determination. This time, the love divination was a perfect fit for this task. Eudora, what did you see? The girl at Eudora's desk couldn't help but ask curiously after seeing her excited reaction. From her perspective, although she could see the human figure emerging from the fog, she couldn't see the face of the human figure clearly. She could only know that Eudora did see her future partner. However, Eudora was immersed in happiness and couldn't hear the voices outside. Not long after, Saraswati, who also had the talent of divination, also saw the figure that appeared in the fog. She wasn't as excited as Eudora, but she just tapped the corner of her mouth in slight surprise. When Heidi, who was at the same table as her, asked, the corner of her mouth curled up, and she said proudly, "Take a guess?" Heidi's face suddenly darkened, and she reached out to scratch her armpit. "You haven't become a prophet yet, and you've learned the bad habit of a prophet? Are you going to tell me or not?" Sarah's amber-like eyes flickered slightly and she smiled. "How about this? When you see it too, let's talk about it together, okay? Then wait for me." Heidi immediately retracted her hand, rolled up her sleeves, and looked like she was going to go all out. She stared hard at the fog in front of her, as if she was staring at the enemy who killed her father. Following closely behind, the fog in front of Ai Ma Métis also reacted. She looked at the changes in the fog with a serious expression. As the figure in the fog gradually became clear, an unexpected person appeared in her field of vision. Susan and Lucy, who were beside her, came over at the same time, but they both looked lonely. Almost at the same time, Luosi also saw her other half in the fog. Her cheeks were slightly red, and her fingers involuntarily clenched. Midya, who was observing the entire classroom from a god's perspective, couldn't help but feel astonished at this moment. These talented girls had actually seen the same person in the fog. Is this good or bad? Dake Dimming, what kind of charm does he have to be able to attract so many outstanding girls at the age of 12? Professor Midya herself was an old leftover woman who had been single since her mother was born. She had never liked a boy since she was a student. Some people said that she was too arrogant, but she thought that it was fate that hadn't arrived yet. Once she was annoyed by people's words, so she took the initiative to look for fate. She traveled on the battlefield as a prophet, and came into contact with many heroes, including the great Magus Peter Sherwich and the brave Blake God. But she couldn't feel what attracted her from them. She gradually felt that perhaps she had set her sights too high. The current situation made her glance at the back of Dake's head, and then she sighed. It's a pity that he's only 12 years old. No matter how hungry she was, it was impossible for her to see the charm of a 12-year-old boy. It was just that it was easy to be blinded by his charm. She glanced away and didn't dare to continue looking. After several students with divination talent succeeded, the rest of the students gradually saw the other half in the fog. Some were pleasantly surprised, and some were surprised. If they saw the people in the same classroom from the fog, then they couldn't help but turn their heads to look. As more and more people showed reactions, the atmosphere in the classroom gradually changed. Professor Midya, who was on the podium, couldn't help but open her eyes, but the eye on the ceiling didn't close. She observed the classroom with two visions at the same time, and she felt an unprecedented surprise in her heart, because she was the only one who could see everyone's fog manifestation. It was indeed beyond her imagination. It even made her have the most direct feeling. Astrology was wrong. At this time, Dake Dimming finally saw the person emerging from the rolling fog. During this process, he finally figured out where the familiar feeling came from. This saying of seeing the other half of the future from the fog reminded him of the love divination card that was popular last semester, which was also the flower card. It was also a love divination. It was also showing the other half. The truth of the flower card was to read minds through magic. What about the fog in front of him? When Dark recalled what Professor Mitya had said about injecting the most sincere feelings into the magic pen, he seemed to have understood something. Therefore, he felt that what he would see from the fog should be what he wanted to see, which was Senior Panduola. However, the person who really emerged from the fog wasn't the black-eyed Panduola, but a blonde boy? Dake Dimming saw himself. What the hell? My other half is myself. The legendary self-attack and self-retribution? Yee. Little Ibu followed the atmosphere and called out twice. In fact, it couldn't see what Dake saw. Dake raised his head in shock, and then he suddenly noticed that he had become the focus of the entire classroom again. All the students, almost all the girls, were staring at him, and it was extremely obvious. The way the girls looked at him at this time was very different from the way they looked at him before. What's going on? Dake couldn't help but look at Professor Midyear on the church. He had a faint feeling. What was happening in this classroom was definitely not a normal situation. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pulled Dake back to reality. He turned around and saw that Luoboat's face was deathly pale. The fog in front of him was rushing out like a tide, and had already filled the entire table. What did he see? 2 in 1 4,500. The monthly votes list is exploding. Brothers, let's vote. Cough, it's been 2 days. I wanted to write 8,000 but I fell asleep. Fortunately, my biological clock woke me up, and I made up for it. Chapter 3:13. Luoboat's scream attracted the attention of everyone in the classroom. The dense fog that surged outwards like a tide shocked the students even more, causing their eyes to widen in shock. Luoboat, white, and the students in front of them hurriedly retreated from their seats. The fog seemed to have gone out of control. Stop! Professor Midyear shouted, and a beam of starlight as thick as a pillar shot down from the ceiling and froze the fog in place. The people around them patted their chests and gasped for breath. Luoboat, what did you do? White whispered. How would I know? Luoboat cried. White, what did you see? Luoboat, I saw. When he thought of that scene, his face turned pale again. Remember the URL, MVIP can't you? 6-inch Luoboat Broheim. Unknowingly, Professor Midyear had already come to his side and reached out to hold his shoulder. Luoboat stopped talking and looked up at her. Professor Midyear smiled and said, There's a small problem. When the light shines, the stars surround the moon. The appearance of the second moon changed the trajectory of the stars and disrupted the operation of astrology. Therefore, what you see in your eyes right now is not what you think. Her words were clear, and her voice spread throughout the classroom, appearing equally in everyone's ears. There was a faint sense of trust. The students didn't understand, but they felt it was amazing. Emma Matisse suddenly threw her hands up in the air. Professor Midyear reached out and said, Speak. Emma then asked seriously, So you're saying that the silhouette we see in the mist isn't the other half of the future? It wasn't originally. Professor Midyear smiled and said, In astrology, every star emits a force of attraction. The higher the level of the star, the greater the attraction. When stars of the same level or higher appear in the same area, they will disturb each other and affect the operation of astrology. What you see is actually the second moon. You mean? Aima couldn't help but look at Dake. So that's not why I saw him in the fog? She opened her mouth and felt an inexplicable feeling in her heart. When Aima sat down, most of the girls seemed to have understood the core meaning of the vague explanation. Saraswati couldn't help but think. In other words, Dake dimming is the second moon that Professor Midyear mentioned. But why is he the second moon? However, Professor Midyear herself didn't know. It was just an explanation that she came up with on the spot when she realized that all the girls had seen dark through the fog. However, after listening to her explanation, Dark came to a sudden realization. I see. He figured it out after thinking about it a little. This should be caused by bliss. The symbol of bliss was the moon. It mixed in with astrology, which was based on the moon, and it caused a disturbance to astrology. As a result, he unknowingly became the center of the entire astrology, forming a new trend of stars surrounding the moon. Because bliss had an outstanding effect on the opposite sex, most of the people affected were women. Of course, he could only see himself. Among the 7 sins, I have the deepest research on pride and bliss. Maybe this is the manifestation of the results. Thinking of this, he was a little happy. However, while Professor Midyear was explaining this reason, she didn't explain the abnormality on Luoboat's side at all. From her actions just now, it could be seen that she deliberately prevented Luoboat from saying what he saw. It could be seen that what Luoboat saw should be caused by his own reasons. Dake thought for a bit and remembered that among the 9 stars that Professor Midia personally pointed out, not only were there Sarah, Aima, Eudora, and Luosi, but there was also Luoboat. Of course, there was also little Ivan. These 9 people were the people in the classroom who had shown their talent for divination. As for the others, they had yet to be discovered. I don't know which one Luoboat triggered. It can't be the first divination, right? Dake suppressed his curiosity. This melon is ripe. Under Professor Midia's intentional guidance, the students also assumed that Luoboat's abnormality was caused by the appearance of the second moon. Even Robert calmed down after being skeptical for a while. When Victor quietly asked him again, he thought for a moment and tried to recreate what he had just seen on his homework using his memory. However, Professor Midia said, "Listen carefully in class," and he quickly put down his pen. The astronomy class went on as usual. Although the students didn't see the other half of the future, as they wished, Professor Midia's teaching purpose was achieved. Therefore, she didn't do it again. Instead, she began to explain. No matter what, she could always attract the attention of the students with something interesting. Soon, most of the students temporarily put aside their previous regrets and devoted themselves to a new story. Until 9 o'clock in the evening, the astronomy class ended with the bell of the spiral clock tower. Because today's assignment was simple reading homework, the students were in a good mood. They chatted and laughed as they left the classroom one after another. However, Luoboat Broheim was asked to stay by Professor Midia. Luoboat was asked to stay, and of course, White wouldn't leave. On the other side, Dake didn't have the slightest intention of leaving. Deanna and Luosi also waited for a while. The last one to stay was Eudora, who asked Professor Midia for advice every time after class. But there were a total of 6 students, and each of them stayed for different reasons. The reason why Dake chose to stay was that he wanted to taste this melon. And on the other hand, he saw the shadow of the flower card from the Love Magic Circle. After discovering the details of the flower card last semester, he had been trying to find a way to refine the flower card. For this reason, he actually went to Professor Kazair. However, Professor Kazair was not omnipotent. As for the former creator of the flower card, Mr. Starfish of the Marine Church, he had lost a large part of his memory after waking up. Mr. Haixing was the most brainwashed, and some sequelae were difficult to eliminate. Moreover, he was no longer in the school. After Dake failed in his search, although he felt regretful, he didn't take it too seriously. Because he had enough flower card reserves and the method to extract Great Sin, the research was also progressing smoothly. If it didn't work, he could still buy the flower card, circulating in the school. Now that the flower card craze had passed, flower card had also become a limited rare product. It was quite difficult to collect a set of different flower cards. However, as long as one was willing to pay the price, one could still collect it. But that was always a temporary solution. It was far better to master the production method of the flower card. Tonight, the Love Magic Circle reminded Dake of the flower card. He wanted to know the core principle of the Love Magic Circle, and then try to study the production method of the flower card. Midia looked at the 6 students left in the classroom, but she didn't mean to drive them away. She sat on the podium and tapped the table with her magic wand. Luoboat walked up with his head lowered. Luoboat. White hesitated a little and followed behind him. The rest of the people also gathered around with interest. Professor Midia glanced at them and said, "You can listen, but you can't leak it." Deanna closed her mouth and patted her chest. The rest of the people also nodded slightly. Professor Midia looked at Luoboat and said, "Broheim, tell us what you saw." Luoboat tried hard to recall and said, "I saw a person. Red hair, pointed ears, face full of blood tattoos, mouth full of fangs like a vampire." Vampire? White couldn't help but ask, "Luoboat, why did you see a vampire? Was it Vlad?" But Vlad didn't have any blood tattoos on his face. Luoboat still had a lingering fear. "No, it wasn't Vlad, it was a female vampire. When I saw her, she was leaning over, biting something I didn't know. I was stunned for a moment. Then she suddenly looked up at me and her mouth was full of blood. I was scared out of my wits." White. Female vampire? Why did you see a female vampire? Luoboat shook his head hard. I don't know, I really don't know. Dark, who was beside him, was also confused. He had thought of many possibilities, but he did not expect Robert to see a female vampire that he was completely unfamiliar with. He couldn't help but ask, "Do you remember seeing someone who looked like that female vampire?" Luoboat shook his head hard again. Professor Midia pondered for a moment and said, "It's strange. I thought you triggered the first divination, but it doesn't seem like it. You really haven't seen that female vampire?" Luoboat couldn't stop shaking his head. Professor Midia hesitated and said, "Maybe have you read any novels about vampires recently or something that left a deep impression on you? I mean, what you think about during the day, you dream about it at night." Luoboat opened his mouth and looked at Dake, as if asking for his opinion. Dake nodded slightly. Luoboat said, "Recently when I played magic chess with Dake, I was defeated by Vlad's chess piece." Midia immediately furrowed her brows and asked, "I wanted to ask you this before, but who exactly is this vampire Vlad? You all seem to know him? Aren't vampires extinct?" Eudora shook her head silently, but no one paid attention to her. Luoboat wanted to explain immediately, but White pulled the corner of his shirt. Dake smiled and said, "Professor, this is a little secret between us." "Secret?" Midia said in relief. "Then there's no other way. So Luoboat, can you describe the image of the female vampire you saw in detail? It's best if you can distinguish the obvious characteristics. For example, the style of blood patterns?" Luoboat, "Let me think." He took out a pen and paper, touched his head, and tried to recall. Finally, he drew a strange symbol on the paper. Copyright. Then he said, "Most of the blood patterns are concentrated on the left side of the face. The middle part is similar to this pattern, and the color is very dark." Professor Midia carefully observed the rune. After a long while, she shook her head and said, "I don't have much of an impression. Maybe you can go to the library and look for it yourself." "Well, actually, this is not a big deal. Maybe it's just because you have a deep impression of vampires, and this time it's a divination for love, so you combine the two and saw such a female vampire." Then she raised her head and said to Dake, "In short, Luoboat's matter ends here. Dimming, what do you want to say?" Dake looked at the professor and said directly, "It's like this, Professor. I want detailed information about a love magic array." Professor Midia was curious. "Is there any additional use?" Dake said, "I want to make a card that can show the person I'm thinking of." Professor Midia was slightly startled. Then she smiled and said, "I didn't expect you to see through it. The love magic array is not a secret. If you want, I can prepare a set of information. Next week, come and get it from me in class." She deliberately emphasized the word secret, hoping that Dake would be tactful. However, Dake pretended not to notice and said gratefully, "Thank you, Professor. We'll go back first." Professor Midia took in a light breath. She could feel it. However, she had no reason to force the exchange student. She could only watch as Dake left with Deanna and Luo. After that, Luoboat and White also thanked Professor Midia and quickly left the classroom. The two groups went down the spiral staircase, one in front and one behind. Dake, on the other hand, was carefully thinking about what Luoboat saw. He didn't think that it was really the product of combining the words female and vampire, as Professor Midia said. However, he couldn't find the slightest clue. However, he was just an outsider. If he really wanted to find out, he would have to rely on Luoboat himself. But the copyright symbol, where did he see it before? However, that was how memory worked. The more you wanted to remember something, the more you couldn't remember it. Dake asked casually, "Do you have any impression of the symbol that Luoboat drew?" He originally thought that he wouldn't get any answers, but he didn't expect Diana to look around and suddenly whisper with a shifty look, "Shoo, I know, Dake." Looking at Deanna's cautious and happy face, Dake couldn't help but want to pinch her little face. But he restrained himself and pinched Ibrahim's cheek. "Since you're so careful, let's go back first." Deanna quickly nodded. Then, they quickly returned to the tower of the aristocrat house. Dake followed Deanna into her dormitory. She hurriedly climbed onto a stool and pulled down a book from the top shelf. Title, 300 Heroes. 2-in-1, Cough, it's been 3 days. F***ck, I'm finally done. Let's make some medicine and continue at night. Majimoto. Chapter 314. 300 Heroes. As the name suggested, it was a book of heroes that recorded more than 300 heroes. Deanna had always been interested in heroes, especially heroines. Therefore, when Professor Claire Kate and Professor Ryan Hux appeared in the academy one after another, she rummaged through the library and found such a book. This book had more than 600 pages, and every 2 pages recorded a hero during the war. Half a page was filled with portraits of each hero. She opened 300 heroes, and the hero at the top was Brett God. The second one was Valkyrie Yvette Saint Dimung. After that, Deanna quickly flipped through the book, and finally found the person she was looking for. When she took out this book of heroes, Dake had already guessed who it was. 1 second to remember. https://m. VIP can't you? VIP. When he looked again, he realized that Deanna had found a heroine. See, I told you. She has the same blood pattern on her face. Deanna pointed at the portrait in the book and said excitedly. Dake and Luosi leaned over at the same time. The 3 people's auras mixed slightly, and continued to ferment like grape wine. Dake read out the heroine's name, Blood Maiden. They didn't know who the author of 300 Heroes was, but his painting skills were really good. The Blood Maiden in the portrait was very lifelike, as if she was alive and about to walk out of the book. She was no doubt a woman full of charm. Her dark red hair was deep and seductive. Her excessively fair skin left a deep impression on others. Her deep eyes and high nose bridge, coupled with her petite but sensual lips, and 3-dimensional facial features made her stand out from the paper. There were blood patterns on her face. However, it wasn't as complicated as Luobot had described. On her left cheek, there was a thin blood pattern that looked like a musical note that extended from the corner of her left eye to her jawbone. In the middle of the blood pattern, there was indeed a symbol that looked like a copyright. But in the written records, she was not a vampire. Moreover, her ears weren't pointy like the elf's ears, but ordinary round ears. There were no vampire-like fangs in the mouth in the painting. Of course, she couldn't be a vampire in the written record. Ophelia Bradley was the name of the Scarlet Blood concubine. She was able to obtain the title of Bloody Concubine because of her birth. Brad was the surname of a minority tribe. They called themselves the Fresh Blood Clan, and worshipped the blood that supported all life. The talents in the tribe were born with the powerful and rare blood magic. Blood magic was a small branch within the vast system of magic. In short, it was magic that manipulated blood, extracting energy from blood. It could cause the blood in a person's body to go berserk from a distance. It directly broke out of his body, causing him to be pierced into a hornet's nest by the blood. He had even created terrifying blood fiends that fed on blood. In terms of blood magic, they were not inferior to another well-known blood magic user, the vampires. During the war, it was to deal with the elusive vampires. The Fresh Blood Clan provided a large amount of information about blood magic for the Alliance Army to carry out targeted defense and attack. For a period of time, the Fresh Blood Clan was very active. They used dark red cloaks to hide themselves. Only the occasional light could illuminate the blood patterns on their faces, making people feel horrified. But not to mention the other races, there were large and small strange tribes among the human race alone. The Fresh Blood Clan was just one of them. Although there were differences in tribal culture, they all had the same human blood flowing in their veins. In the face of a crisis that threatened the entire human race, every tribe was not afraid of sacrificing themselves in the war. Some tribes survived and became more and more prosperous. Some tribes disappeared forever, but their sacrifice was forever left on the title page of human history. The Fresh Blood Clan was one of the tribes that disappeared. As the saying goes, a tall tree attracts the wind. When they became a weapon against the vampires, they also became a thorn in the side of the vampires. It was recorded in the literature. In the middle of the war, the vampires suddenly launched a large-scale attack against the Fresh Blood Clan. The Fresh Blood Clan could not resist the terrifying attack of the vampires, who were the top of the devil race. They were destroyed, and Ophelia Bullard was spared because she had just entered the Shungmalian school at that time. But she lost all her family members since then, even though she had such a cruel life experience. But Ophelia Bullard did not fall silent or fall. She was very gentle and kind, and had a very strong maternal instinct. But as a hero of the golden generation, she was very inconspicuous compared to the hero, the Valkyrie, and the others. So many people did not know of her existence. Even Deanna, who had always been interested in the biography of heroes, only knew of such an unknown hero from the book, 300 Heroes. And the reason for this phenomenon, it was not that Ophelia Bullard was not strong enough. It was because she disappeared not long after she stepped onto the battlefield. Ophelia Bullard was recorded in the book 300 Heroes as a sacrificed hero. Ophelia Bullard. After reading the short content of the 2 pages, Dake lightly breathed in, and then fiercely exhaled. Every hero is great, Yizichin said. He sighed and straightened his back. Tomorrow I'll find Luoboat and ask him if the person he saw was her. Diana was very happy that she could be of use to them. She took out her collection of candies and drinks to entertain Dake, and shared with him what she liked and what she saw. Dake stayed in her dormitory for a while, and then returned to his own dormitory. The magic guide fairies were a little dissatisfied with him being late. They all chattered and asked little Ivan if anything interesting happened during class. Little Ivan finally revealed his most proud smile of the night. He patted his chest and gestured, telling them all the interesting things that happened during class tonight. Of course, only Fairy Ivan and the multiform fairies were listening carefully. The Dilu beast, the little demon beasts, and the trash slimes were blocked outside by the language barrier. Dake sat down in front of the desk. He wanted to connect the dots between the events that had happened tonight. Assuming that the person Luoboat saw wasn't a vampire, but the blood concubine Ophelia Bullard, then he should have come into contact with information related to this hero. This is much more reliable than the female plus vampire theory. But what if it wasn't the blood concubine? If the person he saw was a real vampire, then there's a big problem. I'm afraid that Professor Shi-Erfu will have to examine him. Dake closed the notebook and silently breathed in. The air that entered his mouth was cold. Late at night, after taking a shower, Dake walked out of the bathroom with the damp and hot air. Finally, before the end of Valentine's Day, he remembered something that he still hadn't done tonight. In his hand, there were still 3 chocolate boxes that he needed to open. He had experienced too much today. After enjoying himself to the fullest, he also felt a little tired. But some things, even when he was tired, could still cheer him up. He picked one out of the 3 chocolate boxes. It was a flat square gift box. After opening it, the unique fragrance of chocolate assailed his nostrils. He looked at it. There were a total of 12 chocolates neatly arranged in the box. Each chocolate was round in the shape of a rabbit. Judging from the slight differences between the shapes, this should be a genuine handmade product. It must be Luoxi's, right? Thinking of this, Dake found a small rectangular card on the side. There was only one word written on it. Luoxi Flati 4. Dake smiled slightly. Meaningful things should always be stored away. Only in the future would he have something to remember. He put Luoxi's card together with Deanna's card. Then he picked up one of the long chocolate boxes. He opened the box. Inside was a long chocolate that looked like a cigar. But after Dake carefully took a bite, he found that there was a mystery hidden in the chocolate. Dake's gaze gradually became strange. He had seen cream and wine and chocolate before. But what the hell was with meat floss? Chocolate heart meat? Heart meat? Dake couldn't help but laugh. He was amused by his sudden inspiration. Then he held the chocolate bar with meat floss in his mouth like a cigar, and found a coin-sized card hidden inside. Only the name of Panduola was on the card. On the back, there was a vivid picture of a young pterosaur. There's only one left. Dake solemnly took little Lily's chocolate box. This was the last gift for Valentine's Day. He hoped it wasn't a trick. February 15th. The first day after Valentine's Day. The students walked into the classroom, chatting and laughing. But if you looked carefully, you would find that today, yesterday, and the day before were no different. At least, there were no new couples in the first grade aristocratic and knight academies. It was as if they were eagerly anticipating the arrival of Valentine's Day, But in the end, they were just bystanders. But the final result wouldn't be out until March 14th, so it wasn't certain. But the students gathered together to discuss who gave who the chocolate was, and the final result was quite bleak. After chatting for a while, no one talked about it. It was as if no one remembered Valentine's Day after the first day. Instead, they talked about yesterday's heavy snow and the huge snowman that Professor Lily built. Even now, the enchanted snowman was still standing by the lakeside. It was said that a little fairy sneaked out of the castle late last night. Then, there were flashes of light at the snowman's location. In the morning, the snowman had been refined into a magic tool. It was really a stroke of genius that the students couldn't imagine. And the initiator of this matter was excitedly announcing the completion of the new teaching materials on the podium. But in fact, it wasn't completed. Only the part that Dake was responsible for was completed. But this didn't stop her from showing off to the students as if she had obtained a new toy. When it was finally bound into a book, she was going to do something big. In her words, she had painstakingly sold her beauty. How could she only show off the treasured teaching materials in front of the students? She had to promote it, and let those old professors who always looked at her with colored glasses see who was the most dazzling Xingmalian treasure. Professor Li, who was in a good mood, showed off his skills in the arithmetic class, making the little magisters suffer. After the arithmetic class ended, Dake waved at Luoboat. "Are you looking for me?" Luoboat walked over in confusion. This was the first time that Dake had taken the initiative to look for him. White hesitated for a while in her seat, but still followed him. Dake took out the 300 heroes that he had taken from Deanna and turned to the page with the Blood Maiden. He pointed at her portrait and asked, "How is it, Luoboat? Is this the female vampire you saw last night?" Before he even finished speaking, he already knew the answer. When Luoboat saw the portrait of the Blood Maiden, his face was filled with fear, as if he had recalled the frightening scene he saw last night. He trembled and said, "Yes, it's her. Dake, how did you find her?" Dake frowned and said, "Calm down, Luoboat. This is the Blood Maiden, a hero from the same generation as the heroes. She is also a Xingmalian student. Maybe we can find her in the student files." "This female vampire is our senior?" White stepped forward and said in surprise. Dake glanced at him and pointed at the book. "She is a human of the Blood Tribe, a minority tribe. She is not a vampire." "Not a vampire?" Luoboat finally calmed down when he heard this. Dake wanted to nod, but he felt that something was wrong and hesitated. Luoboat and White immediately looked down. The contents of the book were written clearly, and they soon heaved a sigh of relief. Luoboat even laughed. "It's good that she's not a vampire. You don't know, but I had a nightmare last night. I dreamed that I was bitten by a vampire and turned into a blood slave. That's too scary." But while he laughed heartily, White's face turned pale. Clearly, he recalled the memory of being bitten by a vampire. At that time, he had almost been embraced. He couldn't help but say, "Don't worry, Luoboat. I'm by your side. If anyone was bitten, it would be me who was bitten." TT? After realizing that the person he saw was not a vampire, Luoboat clearly relaxed a lot. He even had the leisure to ramble. "Since this Blood Maiden is a hero of the Golden Generation, why didn't Principal Erdii mention her during his lectures? I've never seen her before. How could I see her in the fog? Could it be that my divination talent is at work, and we will encounter her in the future? Thinking about it, I'm still looking forward to it. Perhaps she is fated to be my guide. Just like the relationship between Professor Mitya and Eudora." White said, "Hey Luoboat, you talk too much. 2 in 1. A day's work begins in the morning." Majimoto. Chapter 315. The 30 minutes between classes quickly passed by. The second class was Professor Kazair's Introduction to Magic. Although Luoboat looked relaxed, that wasn't the case. Just like White said, he talked too much. This was actually a way to hide his inner thoughts. But White didn't think too deeply about it. In class, Luoboat couldn't hear Professor Kazair's words at all. He was almost always thinking about things related to Blood Concubine. Although the book 300 Heroes clearly recorded that blood concubine Ophelia Bullard was a human from a minority tribe, humans didn't have pointed ears and fangs. Although the portrait of blood concubine in 300 Heroes and the female vampire he saw in the fog had the same face, it gave him the feeling that they were two completely different people. Blood concubine was gentle and beautiful. If it wasn't for her dark red hair that was too dark and destroyed her quiet and virtuous temperament, she would look like a nun from the Holy Church. Of course, she wasn't the Sister Kalien type. Website: https://m. But can't you? VIP Luoboat also learned to read in the church. The one who taught them was the nun from that church. Although the nun wasn't beautiful, she had a pure temperament that made people want to get close to her. He couldn't forget it. And the portrait of blood concubine gave him such a feeling. Of course, a portrait was a portrait. It was very likely that there would be a slightly different expression, due to the subjective wishes of the author. But the female vampire he saw in the mist and the portrait were two completely different sides of the female vampire. The female vampire gave him a feeling of awe and terror. Thus, Luoboat couldn't help but think, could that blood concubine have been bitten by a vampire? After a human was embraced by a vampire, they would become a blood slave. Then their bloodline would be purified step by step, and they could advance to become a blood demon, and finally a vampire. Blood concubine was the last of her kind, but she disappeared soon after stepping onto the battlefield. Her whereabouts were suspicious. There were no records of her in the book. It didn't even mention whether she was alive or dead. This was actually very rare. A hero of the Golden Era, a hero who came from the same Shingmalian as the Brave One and the Valkyrie, should not be abandoned by others. This meant that there must be something hidden. Luoboat vaguely felt that he had run into something big, but he didn't want White to know. He had always been a straightforward person, and would say anything on the spot. However, he had encountered a lot of things in the past half a year. He had finally grown up and changed a little. White had just fallen out of love yesterday. As his best friend, Luoboat really didn't want to add more weight to his shoulders. Originally, when AI Ma bluntly pointed out that he was the one who led White astray, he secretly remembered it in his heart. It wasn't easy for Victor to take his studies seriously this semester. He didn't want to disrupt White's study because of him. A teenager's thoughts would always become complicated as he grew up. Luoboat hid his panic and decided to investigate by himself first. If he really couldn't, he would ask White for help, or simply ask Dake for help. In fact, Dake Dimung was also thinking about something similar. There was a well-known path from humans to vampires. When Dake talked with Luoboat, he vaguely felt that something was wrong. Now he finally thought of this point. But this was only a guess based on the current information. There was no conclusive evidence. And after thinking about this point, the irritation in his heart didn't subside. Why do I feel like I've overlooked something? Is there some information that hasn't been connected? Dake couldn't help but ponder. Although his pride was growing every month, he had always thought that he was quite modest. For example, he had a clear understanding of his own IQ and never thought of himself as a very smart person. The reason why his comprehension ability was not bad was that he had received a complete compulsory education and had a set of systematic logical thinking. But when he encountered a real problem, he didn't have the kind of genius to break through the barriers. So he would ask the professor and Panduola for advice. It was precisely because of his calm state of mind that he was able to calm down and think carefully when he encountered a difficult problem. The magic guide class passed quickly. After that, it was time to eat and rest. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he walked into the classroom and prepared for the history of magic class. But as soon as he sat down, he suddenly had a flash of inspiration. Yes, the history of magic class. How could I forget about this? Dake immediately took out the history of magic class notebook. Professor Ryan Harks once gave an assignment in the history of magic class. The students were asked to choose a traitor who was famous in history and write a small paper about him. Dake chose to evaluate one of the war criminals who escaped from Badia prison on Christmas Day, Olivia Copernicus. Because of the deep impression of the Copernicus family name, Dake chose her as his evaluation subject and conducted a certain degree of research on her. Olivia Copernicus. Ophelia Bullard. There was a subtle similarity between the two names. The Blood Princess Olivia Bullard had long dark red hair and delicate facial features. The wanted criminal Olivia Copernicus was a woman with long wine-red hair. Both had red hair, and it was easy to give a similar impression. But what was the similarity between the two? Dake really couldn't say for a while. Olivia Copernicus suddenly appeared at the end of the war, and was wanted by the Holy Church. Before that, there was no record of her. It was as if she had appeared out of thin air. The appearance of the Golden Generation was actually at the end of the war. It took them about 10 years to completely end the war. It was at that time that Ophelia Bullard disappeared. Looking at the timeline, there was no overlap between the records of the two. It was possible that they were the same person. Both of them had different hair colors and appearances, but upon closer inspection, one would find that there were more similarities between them. Dake took the photo of the wanted poster from the newspaper and put it together with the portrait in 300 Heroes. The perspective became very intuitive. The similarity of their facial features made them look like a pair of sisters. In the world of magic, the ability to completely change one's appearance existed, let alone this level of disguise. Finally, Olivia Copernicus was a mixed blood, a hybrid of human and vampire. The uniqueness of the bloodline of vampires had been mentioned before. In theory, there was no such thing as a hybrid vampire in this world. This was because the vampire bloodline was extremely corrosive. It would transform all other bloodlines in the body into vampire blood. Therefore, there was only a difference between the inferior and superior bloodlines. There was no such thing as a hybrid bloodline. However, Olivia Copernicus was indeed a hybrid vampire. This kind of existence that went beyond theory and common sense generally had the ability to go beyond theory and common sense. For example, blood magic. Dake had previously guessed that Olivia Copernicus might have a special power that could resist the corrosion of the vampire bloodline. Now the appearance of blood magic made up for this conjecture. It was like two pieces of a puzzle that could be put together. So was this inevitable, or was it a coincidence? Dake Dimming, stand up and tell me, where was I? The causes of war, Professor. So what are the causes of war? The causes of war include ZZ, economic, social, cultural, and many other factors. Dake calmly dealt with Professor Ryan Huck's sudden questions. He knew that the professor had caught him deep in thought just now. Fortunately, he still had one ear to listen to the lecture. Very good. I didn't expect you to have such a deep understanding of war at such a young age. You are indeed the son of the Valkyrie. Dake Dimming, 5 points. Professor Ryan Huck's words were filled with emotion. Dake, who had unexpectedly received 5 academic points, sat down again, and continued to think about the relationship between the bloody concubine and the hybrid vampire. In the same class, the professor rarely called on the same person more than twice in a row. Therefore, he was basically safe now. As for the other person who was called to answer questions because he was distracted, he was not so lucky. Professor Ryan Hucks is not a hero who was active in the Golden Era. I shouldn't be able to get anything out of him. Professor Kazair, Professor Li, and the others are also new professors. If you want to know more about the bloody concubine's life, you can only go to Principal A. Urti or Professor Shi Erfu. If only Claire was still here. Dake felt a little tired when he thought about having to find the elusive principal and Professor Shi Erfu, who threw wine at him. Of course, his relationship with Professor Shi Erfu was actually not that bad. They were still in the process of cooperation. But thinking about it, Dake suddenly realized that he did not have a reason to investigate the relationship between the bloody concubine and the hybrid vampire. If there's no reason, then find a reason. Scarlet blood concubine, hybrid vampire, Vlad the vampire. Isn't everyone blood? Anything that had something to do with Vlad the vampire was a reason. If the bloody concubine Luoboat saw in the fog was really the same person as the hybrid vampire, then I have to be careful. Or rather, I have to be careful even now. Thinking about this, Dark stopped thinking about it blindly and started to listen to Ryan Huck's lecture seriously. Humans were really interesting creatures. With the help of Professor Kazair, Ryan Hucks put on high-end artificial limbs and eyes, and with the help of Sister Kalien he grew thick hair. He could no longer let himself be sloppy. Every day, whether it was his hairstyle or his clothes, he became more and more exquisite. The current Professor Hux was really as handsome as he bragged. He looked like a handsome uncle. His image changed, and so did the way and content of his lectures. He began to not only tell stories but also talk about the meaning of war, the inevitability of war, and other metaphysical theoretical issues. Occasionally he would also explain some tactics. That was probably the essence of his entire lecture. Ring ring ring. With the end of the history of magic class, the whole day of classes finally came to an end. Although there was still a lot of homework to do, Dake still said goodbye to Deanna and Luosi, and went straight to Professor Shi-Erfa's office alone. Just like how Luobot didn't want White to worry, Dake actually didn't want Deanna and Luosi to get involved. He knocked on the door of the office and found Professor Shi-Erfu in the office grading homework. For professors, grading homework was indeed a tough job. If they could make something like a homework grading machine, it should be able to sell a lot, right? This thought flashed through Dake's mind. Dimming, what's the matter? Professor Shi-Erfu looked up at the future Duke, who was still as elegant as ever, and asked. Dake locked the door and moved a stool to sit in front of the desk. Then he said to Professor Shi-Erfu, Professor, I want to know some stories about Ophelia Bullard from you. Ophelia Bullard. Professor Shi-Erfu couldn't help but put down his pen. His eyes drifted away as if he was reminiscing. No one has mentioned her in front of me for a long time. How did you think of investigating her? The first thing he said was investigating. Dake thought for a bit and said, It's like this. Last night in the astronomy class, there was no need to hide this information from Professor Shi-Erfu. Dake then told him what happened last night in the astronomy class. Professor Shi-Erfu couldn't help but frown. So something like this happened? Did Midya not report it at all? Did you leak information about the vampire Vlad to her? Dake shook his head slightly. The vampire Vlad's name has spread, but we didn't mention any information about him. Professor Shi-Erfu said in a low voice, The seal of the secret passage hasn't moved either. It hasn't made a move yet. I just don't know. Is it not interested in Vlad? Or is it too cautious? Dake changed the topic. Professor, let's talk about the Bloody Concubine. Bloody Concubine? That's a very straightforward name. Professor Shi-Erfu sighed slightly. There was a trace of regret on his face. Ophelia Bullard was a very gentle and kind child. Unfortunately, fate doesn't favor you just because you are a good person. She met with misfortune in her first year of school. Her entire clan was wiped out by vampires. If we don't take into account the hidden clansmen who are in exile, she should be the last princess of the Bloody Concubine. It's not a problem to call her the Bloody Concubine. Dake asked. Then why did she go missing on the battlefield? Shi-Erfu shook his head. I didn't go to the front line. Dake couldn't help but feel disappointed. But Professor Shi-Erfu immediately added. That being said, when the report of her disappearance came out, we as professors did a special investigation. Wait a moment. After saying that, Professor Shi-Erfu got up from his seat, turned around, and went to the bookcase full of books and documents, and carefully rummaged through it. She seemed to have put everything she had for decades in this bookcase. It was full of things. Dake paid a bit of attention. Professor Shi-Erfu's hair color was very similar to Luosi's. Both of them had light blonde hair that looked ethereal from a distance, as if it would vanish into thin air if one wasn't careful. Her ears were long and pointy, which was rare among half-elves. They were almost as long as elves' ears. Originally, half-elves' ears were slightly shorter than elves, and the tips of their ears were slightly rounder. However, Professor Shi-Erfu seemed to have a very strong elven bloodline. The obvious difference in appearance between her and the pure-blooded elves was probably due to the difference in their figures. Pure-blooded elves were synonymous with delicate and slender. It wasn't that none of them were plump, but there were very few of them. Professor Shi-Erfu's figure, on the other hand, was so curvaceous that even the old-fashioned and loose magic robe on her couldn't cover it up. Dake had once entered Professor Shi-Erfu's dormitory during Christmas. At that time, Professor Shi-Erfu was wearing home clothes that accentuated her figure. Whether it was in terms of beauty or heart, She wasn't inferior to Principal Aerdi. While he was thinking, Professor Shierfu had already straightened her back. She pulled out a rolled-up file from a large number of documents stacked at the bottom of the bookcase, and was unwrapping the string to confirm it. This is it. She heaved a sigh of relief, flattened the file, shook off the dust, and then pushed it on the table to Dake. Dake reached out and took it. There wasn't much written information in this stack of files, but there were a lot of photos and other things in it, making the entire file bulge. Take a look first, Professor Shierfu said. After Dake flattened it again, he read it carefully. The information about Bloody Concubine was a record of her journey from the beginning of her joining the army until she disappeared. Bloody Concubine had graduated in the same batch as Hero, Valkyrie, Sage of Beasts and others. She had chosen to join the army at the beginning of her graduation. Of course, the Alliance army wouldn't reject powerful forces like them who were born in the academies. Soon, almost all of them were assigned to the positions that required them. Because Bloody Concubine was the last of the Blood Clan, she wasn't arranged to be on the front lines at first. She was even a target of protection. The Alliance army hoped that with her help, they could make strategic arrangements against vampires and treat some of the injured who had been harmed by blood magic. Bloody Concubine had originally joined the army for revenge, so this position suited her perfectly. Thus, she settled down in the strategy department against vampires in that military region. In the beginning, everything went very smoothly. Her research on blood gave her a very deep understanding of the human body, and her results in treating and saving people were remarkable. The terrifying blood magic became a divine spell in her hands to treat and save people. Vampires were originally high-level demons who rarely came out. Their true numbers weren't many, so Bloody Concubine's work in the strategy department wasn't busy. In order to better help the army, she gradually went in and out of the medical department more often. Because of her gentle and kind nature, as well as her superb treatment methods, she was deeply respected and liked by the soldiers. The name concubine, also known as princess, gradually spread. On the battlefield, heroes who killed enemies at the front lines weren't the only ones who were considered heroes. Those who schemed at the back and saved the dying and the injured were also heroes. Bloody Concubine was a genuine hero. The number of people who gained life and even returned to the battlefield because of her was as many as the stars in the sky. If this continued, she might become a character like the Holy Mother of the battlefield. But the more famous she was, the greater the danger. The vampires, who saw the Blood Clan as a thorn in their side, wouldn't let her rise. On a certain night, the sudden swarm of bats passed through the barrier, without making a sound. Relying on strange magic, they avoided all the vampires who were investigating, and arrived at the rear of the military headquarters without any scruples. Then they began to hunt her down and kill her. Brett God was there at that time? When Dake saw this, he couldn't help but exclaim. Professor Shierfu's face didn't show any joy. She calmly said, at that time, there was a last-minute plan to implement, so Brave Brett came from another military region to help. Although it was just a coincidence, it was undoubtedly lucky. The strength of the high-level vampires was beyond the reach of ordinary soldiers at that time. Brett God's existence provided great support for the regrouping and counterattack of the rear troops. The Holy Sword of the Light Element was a great restraint against the vampires of the Dark Element. Brett, who summoned a batch of Holy Swords, was even able to fight against more than 10 vampires by himself. That was also one of the battles that made him famous on his path to rapid growth. The so-called brave title wasn't something he was born with. Before Brett God's rise, he could only be regarded as a brave reserve. There were many people with similar talents as him, but in the end he was the only brave. But in that battle, Brett was still immature. Although his personal combat strength had gradually taken shape, he was still very lacking in terms of leadership and tactics. In the midst of the battle, Brett even forgot about the person he needed to protect. This became the fatal mistake of the entire battle. Although Ophelia Bullard was not weak, the vampires were also targeting the Fresh Blood tribe while the Fresh Blood tribe was targeting the vampires. Ophelia Bullard's strength was greatly suppressed under the joint attack of several vampires. In the end, the battle continued. Brett God was held back. Ophelia Bullard was seriously injured and captured. The vampires didn't kill her on the spot. Instead, they held her hostage and quickly fled. In the blink of an eye, they turned into bats and disappeared into the horizon. It was only then that Brett God suddenly woke up. He ignored the dissuasion and went alone to save the Blood Maiden. But half a month later, when Brett God appeared in the military camp again, Ophelia Bullard wasn't by his side. Professor Shierfu had sent a joint letter with a few past professors to inquire, but Brett God didn't give them the answer they wanted. He didn't say that she was dead, nor did he say that she was still alive. He just couldn't find her. If they couldn't find her, then there was nothing they could do. But the professors all knew that Brett God was a very mischievous person when he was a student. He wasn't as upright as the rumors said. Instead, he was a noble boy who was very good at lying. But the letter he replied to was full of mistakes. It wasn't like him at all. The professors came to a general consensus. Ophelia Bullard was most likely still alive, but for some reason, she couldn't appear in public. Brett was protecting her. Under such circumstances. Of course, the professors weren't stupid enough to expose this information. They immediately decided to stop investigating. Now that things had changed, there was no point in continuing to keep the secret. That was why Professor Shierfu took out this information. After Professor Shierfu saw that Dake had finished reading the information, he put down his teacup and sighed. Our common understanding at the time is the same as what you're thinking now. It's very likely that after Ophelia was captured, she received the vampire's embrace and became a low-level blood slave. After a human is transformed into a blood slave, their rational side will temporarily collapse, and they will become extremely bloodthirsty. And they have many weaknesses. Garlic, crosses, holy water, silver ornaments. Even sunlight can burn their skin. Vampirization of humans is irreversible, Lucien explained. In the situation at the time, once the fact that Ophelia had become a blood slave was exposed, she would definitely be executed on the spot. So many years have passed in the blink of an eye. Because Brett sacrificed himself in the final battle against the Demon King, we also lost the clue to find Ophelia. I don't know if she's still alive. If she's still alive, in what form is she alive in? The voices gradually died down. Dake listened up to this point, and more or less had his own understanding of what had happened at the time. Then he took out the wanted poster, put it on the table, and turned his head. What's this? Professor Shierfu couldn't help but lower his head. Dake said, take a look. This is one of the fugitives who escaped from Badia prison on Christmas Day. After being recognized, it was published in the newspapers. Professor Shierfu didn't seem to have the habit of subscribing to the Great Sage daily. But it made sense. Elves had a quiet personality and liked peace and quiet. Professor Shierfu was also an elven envoy who was favored by the Wind Elves. She would probably rather walk in the forest than walk in the busy city. Her habit of not liking the secular world made her have little interest in the storms of the outside world. Perhaps all she wanted was to guard this small piece of land and live a peaceful and meaningful life. In Shengmalian Academy, as the vice principal, Professor Shierfu was in charge of internal affairs. Principal Erdi was basically in charge of external affairs. Of course, she must have her own channels to obtain information. She wasn't really stuck in a rut. Seeing the wanted poster, she was a little surprised and said, I know someone escaped from prison, but what's so special about her? Wait, this is a vampire? Dake said, I've checked. It's recorded in the literature as a mixed-blood vampire. It's a very special term. A mixed-blood vampire? Professor Shierfu picked up the wanted poster and looked at it carefully. Then he couldn't help but frown. A mixed-blood vampire who escaped from Badia prison, Olivia Copernicus. Is she related to Ophelia Blood? Dake took out his notebook, opened it, and handed it over. This is the information I collected from my homework on the history of magic. Professor Shierfu couldn't help but take the notebook and read it carefully. She was only halfway through, but her expression had already changed. When she finished reading, Dake could even see anger on her face. This was probably the first time he saw her so happy and angry. Bang! Professor Shierfu suddenly slammed the table and stood up. Dake looked at the notebook on the table with a distressed expression. The corners of his eyes twitched. Professor Shierfa glanced at him, then suddenly exhaled slowly and sat back down. How did you find so much information? Dake thought for a moment and said, The library. Professor Shierfa couldn't help but lean back in his chair. The library? I can't believe you were able to connect the two together. Dake asked, So Professor, what's the relationship between them? Professor Shierfa said calmly, I'm not sure. But since you put the two together, I don't think I need to say more, right? Really? Dake whispered. Then he looked up and said, Let's say we equate the two together. Then the person Luoboat saw in the mist is this person. What's the mystery behind this? Divination. Professor Shierfa said slowly. I can only think of divination. Dake. But Professor Midya said it wasn't divination. Professor Shierfa looked into his eyes and said word by word. Then, how trustworthy do you think her words are? Dake was silent for a moment. Professor Midya's trustworthiness. To be honest, it was quite low. Prophets were all qualified actors. The more famous a prophet was, the better their acting skills were. A prophet like Professor Midya had probably reached the point of being able to predict everything. Last night at the top of the spiral clock tower, Dake couldn't tell how much of what Professor Midya said was true. Professor Shierfa looked at him and said, According to what you said, Luoboat does have a talent for divination. So it's normal for him to trigger his first divination. We can use this as a basis for our calculations. Luoboat is likely to encounter Ophelia in the future. So, where is the most likely place for him to encounter her? Dake said in a deep voice, Right here. Professor Shierfu. Ophelia is probably already at the school. Dake. The invisible person? Professor Shierfu. Possibly. However, she immediately relaxed and said, Of course this is just a guess, there's no evidence. Even if Ophelia wanted to invade the school, she wouldn't be able to do it silently. Dake thought carefully and said, It's possible. But we can't treat a hypothesis as a certainty. If Professor Midya isn't lying and Luoboat isn't divining, then it's very strange that he can see scarlet blood concubine in the fog. Professor, I read in a book that vampires can only be reborn by parasitizing bats. Is this 100% certain? Professor Shierfa's eyes gradually turned cold. No. 4 in 1 8,000 completed. I suddenly received a WeChat message at 10 o'clock last night. Only then did I remember that today is my lunar birthday. Sigh, I'm going to sleep. When I wake up, I don't feel lonely anymore. I really hope that when I wake up, my birthday cake will be filled with monthly votes. Chapter 316. The Disintegration and Rebirth of a Vampire. In short, it was to transform oneself into a group of bats. Each of those bats was a clone of the vampire, and contained all the factors needed to reconstruct the body. Therefore, as long as a vampire possessed one of the bats, he would be able to be reborn. But the above was only a general skill that all vampires could comprehend. High-level vampires could also parasitize other bats other than their own, and obtain rebirth by modifying the bat's body. Of course, this type of rebirth would lead to serious injuries and a significant reduction in strength. In short, bats were a necessary carrier for a vampire's disintegration and rebirth. But this was actually not a necessary condition for rebirth. Because some vampires had a soul strength that exceeded the scope of ordinary vampires, they could use other means to bypass the necessary carrier for disintegration and rebirth. There were such methods such as specter transformation, evil spirit transformation, lich transformation, machine spirit transformation, and so on. Of course, after rebirth through these means, vampires would no longer be vampires. Remember the URL. VIP, can't you? 6. They would lose most of their characteristics as vampires. Therefore, when Professor Shierfa said not, he did not directly refer to the fact that vampires need bats as carriers for their disintegration and rebirth. Instead, it was an instinctive answer after considering that there were other possibilities for vampires to survive. This might cause some ambiguity, but after a clear explanation it was fine. While Dake was slightly enlightened, Professor Shierfu continued to explain. However, creatures like vampires usually have very high self-esteem. They would rather die than give up their identity as vampires. Therefore, they rarely use other means to obtain rebirth. But this does not mean that they can only wait for death. Placing the soul in a living body temporarily, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to be reborn would be a compromise. In fact, we had a similar speculation in the beginning, but the core of the detection at that time was on the white Gouda. Our habitual thinking tells us that even if vampires want to parasitize, they will choose the body of the brave ones. Therefore, the detection of other people was relatively neglected. Vampires were creatures that loved to enjoy life, and the word extravagant was a true description of this race. The so-called soul parasitism, simply put, was to treat a person's body as a house and temporarily live in it. White's body and Luo boats was like comparing a luxurious castle to a small thatched cottage. No one would think that a vampire would choose Luo boat's body as a house. That was why the professors had given Vlad a chance to conceal himself during the body examination. Also, Vlad didn't try to take over Lucien's place in a radical way, but only stayed there temporarily. He didn't show any abnormalities, so he was never discovered. However, Vlad's soul would continue to weaken if he didn't take over. Therefore, it would erupt sooner or later. However, Professor Shi-Erfu had already noticed the oversight. If Luo boat was summoned for a deeper examination, Vlad would probably be exposed. We were indeed negligent in this matter. If Vlad is indeed living in Luo boat's body, then the reason why we couldn't find him in the secret passage is obvious. But this is only a possible speculation. In the current situation, there are two things we need to pay attention to. One is the return of Ophelia Bullard, and the other is the parasitism of the vampire's soul. Professor Shi-Erfu stood up and gathered the information about the bloody concubine back into his hands. He rolled up the file and tied it with a rope. Just in case, we need to do some preparatory work first. Your behavior in the astronomy class last night may have alerted the enemy. She turned around and walked to the bookcase, putting the file back in its original place. Dake also organized his own information and put it back in his bag. He knew that he had to take action next. Not long after, Professor Ka-Zaire hurried over after receiving the news from the wind sprite. After he entered, he said anxiously, "Shi-Erfu, you said you found the vampire. Dake, you're here too?" "Good evening, Professor." Dake walked out from behind the door and waved at Professor Ka-Zaire with a smile. "It's not evening yet, right?" Professor Ka-Zaire asked casually. "Dake, soon." The sun was setting in the west, and the evening glow was coming. It was very close to the time of encountering demons in the evening. Professor Ka-Zaire saw that Dake was also here, and his anxiety gradually subsided. He said gently, "So where exactly is the vampire? Is he dead or alive?" "Well, the vampire can't be said to be a living thing." Professor Shi-Erfu looked at him and said seriously, "In fact, we're not sure. But it doesn't matter. We'll know after we go there." Professor Ka-Zaire was confused. "So, what's the situation?" Professor Shi-Erfu: "Our preliminary guess is that the vampire Vlad might be living in Luo Boat Brohim's body." Professor Ka-Zaire heard this and couldn't help but frown. "That's possible? But I didn't sense the vampire's aura on Brohim's body," Professor Shi-Erfu said. "Maybe we didn't check carefully enough, so he escaped." However, Professor Ka-Zaire said very decisively, "No, I'm sure I checked very carefully." Professor Shi-Erfu couldn't help but stop breathing. "You're sure?" Professor Ka-Zaire nodded and said, "Of course, how could I joke about a student?" Professor Shi-Erfu said suspiciously, "But during the moon god incident," Professor Ka-Zaire's face turned red. "That's two different things." Dake couldn't help but cover his head when he saw Professor Shi-Erfu's disdain for EQ. "Life is hard, don't expose him, Professor." However, Professor Ka-Zaire's speech also exposed a big problem. Professor Shi-Erfu obviously also realized this problem. She couldn't help but mutter, "No, if Ka-Zaire wasn't negligent, then the possibility of the vampire parasitizing Luo Boat's body is very low. But if it really did parasitize Luo Boat's body, then it means that it has a secret technique that can hide from Ka-Zaire's senses. The situation is tricky. Magical technology was very lacking in the development of the brain and the soul. In this regard, Professor Kazair could be considered the Shungmalian authority. If it could hide from Professor Kazair, then the meaning of the prophecy was even more important than the fact that Luoboat was parasitized itself. A vampire that was defeated by Dake Dimung. A vampire that couldn't even remember how many types of magic it knew. A vampire that only had the combat power of a level 7. Now it suddenly became a vampire that could hide from Professor Kazair's senses. Once this fact was established, the threat of the vampire Vlad would instantly skyrocket. And more importantly, even if they found Luoboat now, they might not be able to confirm whether or not there was a vampire parasitizing his body. Professor Kazair couldn't help but say solemnly, "Shi Erfu, tell me the cause and effect. I'm still confused." "Let me explain, Professor." Dake walked to the tea table and poured 2 cups of black tea, one for each of them. He then sat down and slowly explained. Since the matter had already developed to this point, there was no point in rushing it. Professor Kazair patiently listened to him until he finished speaking. Only then did he realize. However, from his perspective, because he was not familiar with the blood concubine, he naturally did not empathize with her as much as Professor Shi Erfu. He analyzed. According to what you said, since the blood concubine Ophelia Blood and the escaped Olivia Copernicus are most likely the same person, then she should be a kind and gentle person, right? Even if such a person is really in the academy, we don't have to worry too much, right? Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but nod. I still believe in Ophelia, so confirming this matter is not a high priority. Hearing this, Dake couldn't help but say, Professor, people change. Professor Shi Erfu said casually. Didn't you write it in the information you collected? Olivia Copernicus originally turned herself in. Which vicious prisoner would turn herself in? Dark furrowed his brows. But she still managed to escape. Professor Shi Erfu said. She has been in Badia prison for more than 10 years. Also, you probably don't know that the heretics who launched a sneak attack on Badia prison at Christmas did not do so to save any prisoners. They only used this as a demonstration to spread terror. It just happened to give some prisoners a chance to escape. A person who turned herself in would escape. She must have her reasons. Dake opened his mouth. He knew that this matter didn't make sense. Professor Shi Erfu always had a straight face. He looked cold and heartless, but there were many people with a cold face who were warm-hearted. Professor Shi Erfu was very biased towards his own student, who was also the hero of the golden generation. Dake even thought that if Olivia Copernicus was confirmed to be the blood mistress, Professor Shi Erfu would even personally pick her up from Badia prison. But if it were him, maybe he would also. And Professor Kazair was relatively calm. In short, we can put the blood mistress matter aside for now. We should pay more attention to Luoboat. We must ensure Luoboat's safety. How about this? As he spoke, he looked at Dake. Dake, can you find a way to ask Luoboat out? In a situation where it's not unexpected. Dake. Professor Kazair, are you worried that the vampire Vlad will become vigilant and parasitize someone else's body? Professor Kazair. Soul parasitism isn't something that convenient. After every parasitic transfer, a part of the soul will be permanently lost. Repeated parasitism will continue to weaken. But even a rabbit will bite when it's anxious. We need to take precautions. Professor Shi Erfu said in a deep voice. If this is true, then it's actually our luck that he's only parasitizing Luoboat's body. If he were to transfer to White's body, the consequences would be unimaginable. White was the son of the hero. Naturally, he had his own special abilities. Dake didn't ask for details. Instead, he said, Luoboat and White are always inseparable. It's very difficult to separate them. Shi Erfu, you can do it, right? Dake. Okay, I can. When Dake walked out of the office, he couldn't help but pat his head. A gust of wind drilled out of his brain, swirled around, and then drilled back into his head. We have to ask Luoboat out without alerting the vampire. At the same time, we have to try our best to separate White and Luoboat. We also have to do it in the middle of the night. The professors are asking for too much. I don't think they want to ask Luoboat out. They want to ask the vampire out, right? But since even Professor Zaire can't sense it, there's nothing we can do. There's still a long way to go. Even though he accepted the mission, Dake wasn't in a hurry. Instead, he first went to the cafeteria to eat his fill, then returned to the dormitory to prepare. At this time, he already had an idea. At this time, in the library, White Gouda and Luobot Broheim were doing homework in the reading room. Although this morning's arithmetic class didn't give them a lot of homework, the two were still very troubled. Luobot couldn't continue writing. He moved a pile of newspapers over from the corner of the table and carefully flipped through them. These were the school newspapers he found in the library. He originally thought that Shengmalian Academy shouldn't have a school newspaper, but when he was looking for records related to Blood Mistress, he unexpectedly found this pile of newspapers. This made him very surprised. This meant that Shengmalian Academy at least had a school newspaper. Since this pile of school newspapers was likely to contain information about Hero and the others, White showed a very strong interest in it. But recently his self-control had improved. He planned to finish his arithmetic homework first. "Hey Luobot, how can you read it first? Give me some." Luobot gave him half of the newspaper. The two didn't know where to start looking, so they just flipped through the newspaper from top to bottom. After flipping through the newspaper, they threw the homework to the back of their minds and began to whisper to each other. About half an hour later, "Look at what I found. There's a group photo here. It looks like a competition. Isn't this Professor Claire?" Luobot took out a newspaper and said excitedly. White quickly leaned over and asked, "Where? Is there a photo of my father?" "There should be, right?" Luobot said proudly. "Let's look carefully." The two of them stared at the palm-sized photo for a while, but White couldn't find his father in it. He couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. Luobot quickly found the person he was looking for, Blood Mistress Ophelia Bullard. Luobot looked at it and couldn't help but mutter. "The face looks the same. But doesn't she have dark red hair? Why is it black?" "White? Black hair? Let me take a look." 2 in 1 4,000 words. I'm finally done. Let's continue after dinner. Chapter 317. Caught in the middle of the crowd, Blood Mistress had her head lowered. She looked a little shy, and her shoulder-length black hair was extremely smooth. From the text, it was probably a group photo taken when they were in 3rd grade. Not only was Blood Mistress in it, but there were also Claire and Yvette. The reason why Hero Brett wasn't included wasn't because he lacked strength back then, but because this was a competition restricted to females. White was more sensitive to long black hair, so he looked at it very seriously. However, he couldn't tell much from this photo. Isn't Blood Mistress a descendant of the Blood clan? Perhaps this black hair was her original hair color, but after she started practicing blood magic, her hair color changed? White stroked his chin as he speculated. However, his unintentional guess made Robert's face turn ghastly pale in an instant. Hair color could change. If practicing blood magic could really make one's hair turn red. No wonder he kept feeling that the Blood Mistress he saw in the fog had redder hair than the Blood Mistress in 300 Heroes. "Luobot, are you alright?" White noticed the abnormality and couldn't help but ask. "Remember in a second. https://m, VIP can't you?" VIP Luobot quickly composed himself and said, "Of course I'm fine. Let's continue looking. Maybe we can find something new?" Just as the two were reading the school newspaper together, Panduola welcomed an uninvited guest at the front desk of the library. She narrowed her eyes and looked at the girl, who appeared at the door. She couldn't help but frown. There were people coming and going in the library every day. Of course, she wouldn't remember everyone's appearance, but this girl gave her a very strange feeling of unfamiliarity. It seemed to be an inhuman aura. She couldn't help but feel a little wary. However, the person who appeared behind the girl made her let down her guard. Not long after, the girl went around the counter and entered the spacious reading room. She had short black hair, double eyelids, long eyelashes, and a cherry mouth. Her school uniform was slightly loose, but it made her look petite and cute. After entering the reading room, she walked carefully, her eyes darting left and right as if she was looking for something. After a long while, her eyes suddenly lit up and she walked straight towards White and Luobot. Newcomers always attract extra attention. The students who were reading homework couldn't help but raise their heads to take a look. Some people had already seen it. Some people looked at her curiously, wanting to see who she was looking for. When people thought she would pass by the table where White and Luo were sitting, she suddenly stopped and stared at White in front of the table. White was startled by the light, and couldn't help but raise her head to look at the girl's bright and spirited eyes. White, who had never been stared at by a petite and cute girl, suddenly felt a little flustered. Her heart started to beat faster. Luo, who was reading the school newspaper, looked up a beat later and asked, "Who are you?" The girl seemed to be startled by him, and subconsciously took half a step back. White complained, "Don't scare people. May I ask why you're looking for us?" But the girl didn't answer. She only pursed her lips and carefully looked at him. White was sure he was being observed, which made him very uncomfortable. However, very quickly, the girl suddenly raised the hand that she had hidden behind her back. Then, she abruptly leaned forward and stretched out her arm. In the palm of her hand was a box of chocolates. Looking at the box of chocolates and the girl biting her lips stubbornly and shyly, White was stunned. Luo, who was next to him, also froze, as if he had been hit by a paralysis curse. For them, this was a scene that they could only see in their dreams. A very, very, very cute girl gave them, no, only White's chocolates. Although it was the day after Valentine's Day. But even if it was only a day later, it still counted, right? Ha ha. Luo laughed dryly in his heart. White was so excited that his hands trembled. He couldn't help but ask, "Is it for me?" She was so careful that it was as if she was touching a dream. It was as if the dream would shatter if she spoke a little louder. The girl nodded slightly. White couldn't help but reach out and take the chocolates. Then the girl let go of her hand and suddenly bowed as if to thank him. Then, when White wanted to say something, she suddenly turned around and ran out of the reading room. She gave the impression of a very shy girl who finally decided to give the chocolates to the person she liked after Valentine's Day. After the chocolates were given, she ran away shyly. "But who the hell is she?" Luo whispered after she ran away. But White didn't agree with him. Instead, he put the box of chocolates on the table, let go of his hand, and stared at it carefully. After a while he said, "Luo, what do you think I should do?" Luo joked, "She's pretty cute, isn't she?" White muttered, "But I already have someone in my heart." Luo, "This involves an eternal problem." White, "What problem?" Luo, "Between the person you love and the person who loves you, which one will you be happier with?" White, "If it were you, what would you choose?" Luo, "Of course I'd choose the person who loves me." White, "Then he couldn't help but hesitate. It was only yesterday that he had been ignored. But now he still couldn't make up his mind. "Let me think." It took him half an hour to think about it. White hesitated, but in the end he didn't open the box of chocolates in the library. When it got late, he left the library with Luo. As usual, Panduola registered his departure, just like everyone else who came to the library. White gradually realized that giving her chocolates wouldn't attract her attention, because she received too many chocolates on Valentine's Day. It wasn't that there weren't any other outstanding girls at the school, but Panduola was the librarian, so all the students at the school had access to her. So there were a lot of people who admired her. Amidst so many people, Werther didn't stand out at all. His identity as the hero's son didn't have much use. In contrast, there was another girl who had noticed him, and she personally gave him a box of chocolates. White thought a lot on the way from the library to his dorm. Finally, he made a decision. "Hey White, let's play a round after you shower?" Luo waved at him in the hallway. He subconsciously said, "Of course I'll wait for you." Then he unlocked his door, and quickly sat down at his desk. He put his bag on the desk and took out the box of chocolates. After putting the box of chocolates on the desk, White took a deep breath, clapped his hands like he was on a pilgrimage, and began to open the box. "Is this store-bought chocolates?" The moment White saw the chocolates, he couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. He saw that the box of chocolates was homemade, so he thought that the chocolates inside were also handmade. Handmade chocolates weren't necessarily as delicious as store-bought chocolates, but it represented the intention. White valued this. Maybe she's a clumsy girl. White quickly found a reason for himself. Then he found a card in the box and couldn't help but sigh in relief. The worst thing was that he didn't know her name and school. That would be very difficult to find. But when he took out the card, he found that there was no name on it. If you think I can do it, please reply to me. Tonight at 11 o'clock, I'll wait for you here. Equals. At the end of the card was a small map. Although the map was simple, it was easy to recognize the location at a glance. It was the bridge where White opened into the abyss for the first time under the full moon. Because of its location, the bridge between the castles was often a place for couples to date, so some students called it Lover's Bridge. It was indeed a good place to meet up. But at 11 o'clock at night, White's heart was beating like a drum. Should I go or not? 11 o'clock at night, only an hour before the curfew, and there are magic statues patrolling. But if I don't go, will she keep waiting there? If I miss the curfew because of waiting there, won't it be my fault? Knock, knock, knock. Someone knocked on the door. White snapped back to reality. He quickly put away the card and went to open the door. Luoboat, who had quickly taken a shower, walked in wearing plush pajamas and holding a magic chess set in his hand. White hesitated for a moment, but still decided to play chess with him. But at 10:30, he looked at Luoboat, who wanted to play another game, and said hesitantly, "Luoboat, I want to go to bed early tonight." Luoboat froze for a moment. His eyes inadvertently glanced at the chocolate box on the desk, and then he simply said, "Of course, I'm a bit tired today." So he packed up the chessboard and quickly returned to his dorm. But after he put down the chessboard, he went to the door and opened it a little. Tonight, when Werther was playing chess, he had been absent-minded the whole time. It was obvious. Sure enough, it didn't take long before he heard footsteps from White's dorm. So it's starting? Luoboat couldn't help but feel a little relieved. White finally gave up on the impossible Chen Yushan. He really thought that the girl who gave him the chocolate was pretty good. Her hair was black, which was White's favorite color. Even though her hair was short, it would grow out with time. Luoboat thought as he opened the door and quietly followed White. Don't ask me why I followed her. Who doesn't like gossip? 3rd floor of the castle. Same old place. Dake leaned against the window and looked at the Lover's Bridge on the 2nd floor. He couldn't help but feel a little sorry. If he had any other choice, he wouldn't have come up with this plan. But in this situation, there weren't many ways to lure Luoboat out without him being vigilant. Also, he had to make sure that Luoboat and White were separated by a certain distance in the middle of the night, which was a dangerous time. Everything is to check if there's a vampire in Luoboat's body. Presumably, White will understand when she finds out. Dake was a little embarrassed as he flipped the magic card in his hand. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat. Here it comes. For tonight's operation, Professor Kazair specially adjusted the patrol route of the golems. White successfully avoided all the golems and arrived at Lover's Bridge before 11 o'clock. As soon as he arrived at the bridge, the cold wind blew over. He couldn't help but grab his collar and pull it together. Then, as if he had made up his mind, he walked to the other side of the bridge. It was almost time. If the girl was already here, she should be on the other side of the bridge. When he crossed the bridge, someone quietly peeked out half of his head from the direction he came from. It was Luoboat who followed him. Luoboat was very familiar with White, so when he followed him he always kept a distance from White. He didn't use his eyes to look behind him. He only followed him by listening. He was very satisfied with his performance tonight. He really wanted to praise himself as a stalker master. I hope they'll be successful. Luoboat couldn't help but wish him well. He turned around and didn't go any further. When White reached the other side of the bridge, he finally saw the girl. The girl was wearing a school uniform and stood there quietly, like a petite jasmine flower. White suppressed the excitement in his heart, but he couldn't help but speed up. When White was in front of the girl, he took the initiative to say, "Good evening, I still don't know your name." Busy. For the first time, the girl spoke in front of a boy. White asked, "What?" Then he said, "Mang Mang? You're called Mang Mang?" Girl, busy. White, In short, it's Mang Mang. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to receive your chocolate tonight. Just as White was whispering, the girl's head suddenly began to melt. From the top of her head, it melted down like a candle. The originally delicate facial features and cute face. White was stunned for a moment. Then his whole body trembled from the terrifying scene, and he let out a piercing scream from his throat. The sound disappeared. It was the familiar silence card. Has it started? Dake picked up the Monster of Variety magic card in his hand and felt the changes of the monster. He gradually knew what was going on. He listened attentively. Something was slowly approaching from all directions, and there were many of them. Everything was under control. And on the second floor of the castle under his feet, at the end of Lover's Bridge, Luoboat Broheim was leaning against the wall thinking. Suddenly he saw a golem coming over. He was shocked and quickly curled up in a corner. 2 and 1 4,000. Today's update is 8,400. Chapter 318. Luoboat had managed to avoid a large number of golems on the way from the Knights Institute Tower to Lover's Bridge, greatly lowering his guard against them. Although he had the bitter experience of being chased by a golem, if everyone could learn from their mistakes, then the world would be full of smart people. Moonlight shone in from the outside, sandwiching the walls on both sides of the corner, forming a triangular shadow. Luoboat looked at the approaching golem and hurriedly held his breath, doing his best to curl up his body into the shadows. But of course, this kind of deceiving oneself would not succeed. The golem model was called Light Cavalry. It was about 2 meters tall and half a meter wide. It was covered in light armor. Its lower body was mainly made of rollers, but it also had spider legs. Light Cavalry moved relatively fast, and its spider legs were sticky, allowing it to stick to the walls of the castle. This meant that it could truly leap over roofs and vault over walls. Light Cavalry mainly used dual swords as weapons, and the Light Cavalry in front of him was the same. The axis of its waist was a disc that could rotate 360 degrees, and it was best at killing by unfolding its dual swords and rotating its waist to form a blade storm. Unlike the Heavy Cavalry, that had a paralysis gem on its forehead, the Light Cavalry did not have any long-range magic skills. It would usually use its spider legs to suppress its enemies, making them surrender but not kill them. Website, https://m, VIP can't you? VIP, don't kill creatures other than the magic guiding sprite, was an iron rule engraved in the core of all golems. Therefore, the students did not have to worry about being killed by the golems. What they had to worry about was being caught by the golems and being punished by the school rules and confinement. Luoboat did not want to be confined. But while he was trembling, the golem did not change its direction at all and walked straight towards him. And it was gradually accelerating faster and faster. By the time Luoboat realized that something was wrong, the golem had already pulled out its dual swords and swept towards him like the wind. Fuck! Luoboat's face suddenly revealed a frightened expression. Then he suddenly threw himself outside, covering his head and fleeing like a rat. At this time, of course, he could no longer care about whether or not White had discovered him. Although the golems could theoretically stop when necessary, no one would really leave their life in the hands of the golem's internal circuits when the blade was pointed at them. Who knew if this ancient golem would break at a critical moment? With his path blocked, Luoboat could only run towards Lover's Bridge. But as soon as he got on the bridge, he suddenly realized, why did this scene seem so familiar? Fuck! The last time I was caught was also here. Robert jerked his head up and looked at the other end of the bridge. Last time, it was precisely because 2 golems had occupied the 2 ends of the bridge and surrounded them on the bridge that they had no way to escape. This time, would a golem on the other side? SSSFs? That can't. White. S's. He. S. S's. SS in his panic. Luoboat did not realize how strange it was that not a single sound was. In this critical moment, he took out a magic card from the card bag he carried with him and quickly recited the usual summoning spell. As the magic card lit up with a white light, an ugly rat man, who was as tall as a human, appeared behind him. This magic elf named Ratman Cyborg had a simple mechanical structure on its left and a rotten body on its right. It carried a box full of acid on its back and a huge acid ejector in its hands. Card name, Ratman Cyborg. Type, Elf card. Level, Yin race. Machine, attribute, Steel. Magic power, 900. Attack, 900. Defense, 800. Ultimate skill, acid ejector. Under its master's command, the ferocious Ratman Cyborg lifted its acid ejector and sprayed it at the light cavalry that was chasing from the front. However, when the highly corrosive acid hit the light cavalry, it just slid off like water and didn't cause any damage. The difference in level between the two was too great. Luoboat did not need to turn his head to know that this would be the result. In fact, he had already verified it the last time in this same place. At that time, his Ratman Cyborg could not even last one round. In a very short period of time, the light cavalry used the rotational force of its waist to open its abdomen with two swords and instantly cut it in half. It was a coincidence. This time, the Ratman Cyborg was repeating history. Looking at the Ratman Cyborg that was cut in half and turned into a beam of light that quickly returned to the magic card, Robert was neither sad nor happy. There was only fear. The amount of time that the Ratman Cyborg had bought was shorter than he had expected, and if he wanted to summon the next magic card, he would have to wait for the cooldown to end. White. In his anxiety, Luoboat shouted in a panic. This was both a request for help and a reminder. He did not know if White was indulging in his woman and did not notice the movement here, but he had to make him react. Whether it was support or escape, it would depend on White himself. But there was still no sound from the other end of the bridge. Could it be that White has been caught in such a short period of time? This thought appeared in an instant. Luoboat's brain almost stopped working. Could it be that he encountered the dragon cavalry? Despair invaded his mind. At the window on the third floor, Dake looked down at Luoboat on the bridge. Until now, he was not sure if Luoboat was possessed by a vampire. In theory, what he did tonight was very likely to be useless. But if he could rule out this possibility, the possibility of the other option would be greatly increased. After that, he would have to look for the blood mistress. In short, he had to eat one bite at a time, and investigation had to be done step by step. At this time, he just needed to quietly watch the show. The thing that Luoboat was most afraid of did not happen. After the light cavalry statue killed the Ratman Cyborg, it did not immediately catch up to him. He successfully ran to the other end of the bridge, and he did not find any golems squatting at this end. Yes, although White Gouda and his girl were not here for some reason. But this side was safe. Whoosh! Luoboat, who was about to rejoice, subconsciously turned his head to see where the light cavalry had gone. But when he turned his head, he was almost scared out of his wits. He saw that at least a dozen golems were gathering at the end of the passage where the light cavalry was located. Could it be that I poked a hornet's nest? Looking at those magical golems of different shapes and sizes, Robert really wanted to bang his head against the wall and end it all. Among the golems, there was not only the agile light cavalry, but also the defense-specialized heavy cavalry, as well as a small golem used for reconnaissance, Beetle. The Beetle golem was less than half a meter tall. It was petite and its main body was a disc like a cleaning robot. From the middle of the disc, there was a retractable structure that acted as the neck. At the top of the neck, there was a round head with two protruding compound eyes on the head. In addition to increasing the range of vision, the two compound eyes could also record images. The gem between the eyebrows was used for alarms and summoning companions. As long as it detected the target, the beetle golem would make a biu-biu-biu alarm sound and summon nearby golems. Below the beetle disc, there were 4 rotatable wheels and small spider legs that were usually stored in the disc. Although those spider legs could not support it to stick to the wall, they could be used to cross most complex terrains. As long as the beetle targeted it, it would be very difficult to escape. But in fact there were not many small golems beetles. Most of them were placed near the entrance of the secret passage. Although the beetle had aroused Luoboat's vigilance, what really scared him was the Dragon Knight, mixed in with the golems. The Dragon Knight wielding a great sword was like a god of war, exuding an aura of despair. Scared to death, Luoboat did not dare to stay any longer. He madly ran forward. His running speed was fast enough that the golems behind him could not catch up to him. At least that was what he believed. Luoboat ran wildly. Thanks to his previous experiences, he was quite familiar with the terrain here. Relying on his excellent physical strength, he actually managed to shake off the golems behind him. Seeing that the golems behind him were gradually disappearing, he suddenly squeezed into a corner and leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. Only then did he suddenly remember. So where did White go? While thinking, he suddenly raised his head. The tall walls of the castle were reflected in his eyes, as if they went straight to his brain. The entire passage was extremely spacious and silent. The deep chill of the night seeped into his bones. Luoboat's mind calmed down, but he also suddenly felt the loneliness and fear of being alone in this huge castle. But at this time he finally displayed the courage of a student of the Night Academy. Summoning the courage to face his fear, Luoboat slowly stood up straight with the support of the wall. So, what should I do next? Should I go find White, or return to the tower? But just as he stood up straight, he suddenly noticed a dark shadow hanging down from the side. The frequently flickering red light shone in his eyes. A beetle appeared at the corner without a sound. Biu-biu-biu. The alarm of the beetle suddenly sounded and almost immediately spread everywhere. Then Luoboat directly heard the rustling sound of something rolling from all around him. Those golems were coming again. Luoboat had no choice but to run again. Then he fell into an endless cycle of fleeing, and fleeing again. And behind him, after the wave of golems, White, who was almost scared to death by the polymorphic monster, was submissive and didn't dare to complain. Because the person next to him was Professor Shi-Erfu. Professor Sarah Shi-Erfu walked behind the golems with a serious face. A light green wind constantly blew from the front, swirling around her ears and the corners of her eyes. Although they were far away, Luoboat and the surrounding situation were always under her control. White wanted to ask what she was doing, but seeing how focused Professor Shi-Erfu was, he didn't dare to disturb her. Half an hour later, he finally couldn't help but ask, "Professor, the person those golems are chasing is Luoboat?" Professor Shi-Erfu didn't refuse to answer as he expected. "Yes, it's Luoboat." White mustered up his courage and asked, "Why?" At this time, he had roughly guessed that the purpose of the girl drawing him out wasn't for him, but to indirectly fish out Luoboat. But what was the value of fishing out Luoboat? Although White knew it wasn't right to think this way, at that moment he really thought so. Professor Shi-Erfu glanced at him and said indifferently, "We suspect that the vampire Vlad is parasitizing Luoboat's body." They didn't tell White about this at first because they were afraid that he wouldn't be able to disguise himself well and accidentally leak it. But now that the plan had begun, there was no harm in telling him. The vampire Vlad. Impossible. How could he be hiding in Luoboat's body? White wanted to deny it at first, but after thinking carefully, he suddenly became speechless. Since Christmas, Luoboat had indeed shown some abnormalities. Perhaps others couldn't sense it. But he and Luoboat had always been inseparable, so he was most aware of the changes in Luoboat. Now that he thought about it, some knowledge that should have been obscure could always come out of Luoboat's mouth. Luoboat, who had no other strong points except for his physical strength, actually had a gift for divination. Luoboat, who had a headache when he saw words, was now able to calm down and read books. Even the time he spent playing magic chess with Luoboat was limited. No matter how one looked at it, the current Luoboat was a completely different person from the past. White couldn't help but murmur, "So, Dake suddenly used Vlad's chess pieces to play magic chess some time ago because of this?" Professor Shi-Erfu. "No, that's another matter." There's another matter? White didn't know why, but he suddenly felt like a newborn baby who didn't know anything. Professor Shi-Erfu didn't mention the other matter. Instead, he asked, "You don't seem to be too surprised that there's a vampire hiding in Luoboat's body?" White scratched his head. "I think there's a trace." Professor Shi-Erfu. "Is that so? Then it seems that we might have a harvest tonight." After a while, Professor Shi-Erfu suddenly raised his eyebrows and said, "Kaze, are you sure?" On the third floor of the castle, Professor Kazair, who was following Luo Boat from above, had his eyes shining. Dake, who was following him, couldn't help but be excited. Professor, did you sense it? Professor Kazair smiled. Yes, just now, a trace of blood leaked out from Luo Boat's position. There's no mistake, it's a vampire. 2 in 1. The rumor of exploding subscriptions is actually true. Hungry. Chapter 319. Everything was going according to plan. Dake and the 2 professors had watched the entire process from the moment the polymorph transformed into a chocolate delivery monster. If there was a mistake in any part of the plan, they would find a way to make up for it. But in fact, the plan went a lot smoother than expected. Dake had a thorough understanding of White and Luo Boat's personality and behavior patterns. He had predicted almost all of their reactions. That was why the current scene was happening. Professor Kazair had adjusted the behavior patterns of the golems along the route, making them cooperate with Luo Boat to play the game of cat and mouse. The goal was to make Luo Boat feel threatened again and again. This would make the vampire's soul inside his body react. The soul and the body were bound together for good or ill. Since there were no other parasites around him, Vlad's soul would definitely disperse if Robert died. Remember the URL. MVIP, can't you? VIP. Therefore, as long as Luo Boat was in danger, and he felt that it wasn't a deliberate trap, there would be a chance to lure the vampire out. As long as he exposed a trace of his presence, Professor Kazair would be able to rely on his extremely strong mental power to detect and confirm his existence. The flaw in this plan was that last night's astronomy class had already alerted the enemy. Therefore, Vlad's vigilance was likely to be higher than usual, making it harder to trick him. Fortunately, Dake's method was indeed perfect. Even Luo Boat himself would only think that all his actions were his own subjective decisions. And Vlad's shrewdness didn't seem to be as deep as imagined? That was the truth. Because Vlad had escaped Professor Kazair's detection, Professor Kazair and Professor Shi-Erfu had always treated him as a wise and farsighted person. However, Vlad was actually an arrogant vampire who had lost most of his memories. If he hadn't been beaten up by Dake in the secret passage, he wouldn't even know how to restrain himself. But even so, after parasitizing Luo Boat's body, it exposed some small flaws. A few minutes ago, Luo Boat, who had been running for a long time, was finally pushed to his limit. The physical strength that he was proud of was gradually depleting. He could already feel that his legs were weak and his abdomen was in pain. During this process, the magic cards that he had accumulated over a long period of time were almost used up, but he was still unable to completely shake off the magic statue's search. The only thing that comforted him was that he had not seen White even after running for so long on the second floor of the castle. This made him feel that White must have been lucky enough to avoid the tide of golems. Perhaps she had already returned to the dormitory before the curfew. That's right. It was already past 12. It was time for the curfew. He could no longer return to the dormitory. Luo Boat's despair deepened at the thought of having to spend the night outdoors in such a cold night. It seemed that when White wasn't around, his luck wasn't very good. Last time, when he went out to chase after White, he was met with an unexpected disaster and slept outside for a night. Although he hadn't been caught this time, the outcome of sleeping outside seemed to be doomed. These two things together fully explained that tailing was not a good idea. In the blink of an eye, he once again came to a familiar corner, and then drifted around the corner. Bang! Almost without warning, he kicked a beetle, and the whole body tilted forward as a result. Seeing that he was about to fall to the ground, Luo Boat grabbed the beetle's long neck at the critical moment, and barely supported his body. But as the beetle's neck gradually bent, he had to use his other hand to support his body on the ground, and tried to slow his fall as much as possible. At least he didn't fall too hard. However, with this delay, the beetle immediately issued a hurried alarm, and the red gem between its eyebrows flashed wildly. Not only the golems chasing from behind, but even the patrolling golems in front of him also moved after receiving the call. Luo Boat relied on the roll to reduce the force. After getting up, he hurriedly fled forward. But just as he started to move, he heard the sound of wheels moving closer and closer. This caused his expression to change in an instant. Surrounded. He didn't have time to think. A light cavalry chasing from behind had already rushed around the corner, and the long sword in its right hand chopped down without a trace of delay. Hiss! Luobo's robe was instantly torn open by the sword. But he didn't have time to feel distressed, and he continued to rush forward in panic. However, after a few steps, a black shadow flashed across the road ahead. Another light cavalry had blocked the road ahead. There was a wolf in front and a tiger behind. Luobo's heart instantly fell to the bottom. Under the pressure of the light cavalry in front of him, Luobo suddenly stopped, and then subconsciously put his hand into his card bag. But after the magic flowing at his fingertips brushed across the side of the magic card, he only received a message that made him feel despair. Whoosh! In an instant, the sound of a long sword piercing through the air was heard. Luobo's face suddenly changed. He couldn't judge from which angle the long sword was coming from behind, so he could only use all his strength to throw himself to the side. This throw allowed him to successfully avoid the attack of the light cavalry behind him. However, after his body fell, he lost his balance. He wanted to stand up again, but his limbs were weak. For a moment, he could only stick to the wall, looking at the two light cavalry, gradually approaching him with a face full of horror. The approaching light cavalry was in front of him in 2 steps. He saw it raise the sword in its left hand, suddenly lean forward, and with the strength of its left arm, the long sword pierced through his head and nailed him to the wall. Ah! There was a delay of half a second. Luobo screamed in horror. Then, the light cavalry maintained its posture of leaning forward, its 2 spider legs raised high, and the sharp tips of its feet fiercely pierced the sides of his neck. It formed a triangle with the long sword, locking Luobo's head in the middle. Luobo suddenly panicked and didn't know what to do. His whole body trembled, and he didn't dare to move. He raised his head slightly, and stared firmly into the eyes of the light cavalry, as if he was afraid that a beam of light would burst out from those mechanical eyes. On the other side, the light cavalry, blocking the road in front of him, also walked over. It actually stopped at his side, and then raised the long sword in its right hand over its head, and looked as if it was about to chop down his head. At that moment, inside Luobo's body, the vampire Vlad finally couldn't help but leak a trace of his aura. A layer of blood-red light flashed through Luobo's eyes in an instant. In a situation where he himself didn't know what was going on, his right hand actually reached into the card bag again. Then, with a flip of his fingers and the flow of magic power, a small magic array emerged inside the card bag. As the magic array lit up, a hidden compartment appeared inside the card bag. It wasn't until his fingers reached in and touched the cold card in the compartment that Luobo suddenly woke up. Where did this magic card come from? There was no time to think. Luobo quickly injected magic power and chanted the usual summoning spell. To him, this magic card was like a treasure chest that had fallen from the heavens. It was a timely help. No matter what, he had to use it. In the name of Vlad, magic summoning. Vlad. While Luobo was frightened and puzzled, the red light in his eyes became more and more intense. His body was no longer under his control. He raised his right hand, and the magic card hidden in the hidden compartment was drawn out. Then the dark red magic card was raised high. A glaring blood-red light flashed. A giant bat with scarlet eyes suddenly flew out from it, and the blood-red halo that erupted in an instant produced a powerful thrust, pushing away the light cavalry in front of Luobo and the other light cavalry on the side. The liberated Luobo wanted to lift his feet and escape, but he was shocked to find that both his hands and feet were out of his control. At this moment, the panic that was more intense than when he was suppressed by the light cavalry was infinitely magnified in his brain. He found that he had already become a marionette, and from the spell that he blurted out, the one who lifted him up was actually that terrifying vampire, Vlad. Vlad the vampire. Chess piece, fog, divination, bloody concubine. Even Luobo finally connected some clues at this moment, and combined them together to form his own judgment. Although this judgment wasn't completely correct, his understanding of the situation at this moment was completely correct. I've been possessed by Vlad? At the moment when his body was being manipulated, Luoboat couldn't express the fear and anxiety in his heart through any part of his body other than his expression. His face twitched and twisted. Suddenly, he saw that the giant bat, after pushing the light cavalry away, turned around and faced him with a mouse-like face full of coarse hair and scarlet eyes. Then, the giant bat actually counterattacked. Under his fearful and helpless gaze, he bit down on his neck. The cold feeling of blood loss spread throughout his body. Luoboat screamed crazily in his heart. But his voice couldn't be heard. And after the bat sucked a big mouthful of blood, it actually stopped. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Luoboat had a feeling that the bat seemed to be looking at him and communicating with his eyes. But he didn't understand it at all. He only saw blood slowly dripping from the bat's fangs in its huge open mouth. It was his blood. Squeak. The bat suddenly let out a scream. Then it abruptly turned around and rushed toward one of the light cavalry. He saw that the light cavalry had already regrouped. It raised both its swords and stabbed at the wings of the bat like the wind. Although the bat was fierce, but its wings were still weak and were directly pierced by the swords. If it was before, Luoboat couldn't wait for the light cavalry to be defeated on the spot. But at this moment, he only wanted to see the bat be cut in half. But things didn't always go as one wished. The giant bat, whose wings were pierced, didn't hesitate to close in. Suddenly, a strong bloody light erupted from its body, illuminating the entire passage. Boom. There was a loud noise. That giant bat, after absorbing Luoboat's blood, chose to self-destruct. This explosion was earth-shattering. The light armor of the light cavalry was actually blown to pieces. When the explosion subsided, a pitch-black hole had been blasted open in its chest. It was completely scrapped. Just when Luoboat thought that the giant bat had also completely disappeared with this explosion, blood was gradually condensing in the air. Then small bats condensed from blood were born one after another. More than 10 small bats were flying in the air in groups. The remaining light cavalry followed the guidance of the internal circuit and abandoned Luoboat, who was gradually standing up. It raised its swords and rushed toward the bats. Luoboat could clearly hear his own breathing. He suddenly regained some feeling in his hands and feet. It seemed that the vampire Vlad's manipulation of him was only temporary. But when he stood up with difficulty, he suddenly felt a huge impact in his head. Then his whole body froze in place like a wooden puppet. He lost consciousness. And the vampire Vlad had completely taken over his body. Damn trash. Vlad opened his eyes. His pupils were suffused with the color of blood. He stretched his limbs, which he hadn't stretched in a long time, but what he felt was the soreness and weakness in his limbs. Choosing Luoboat as the host was a last-minute decision he made after his self-confidence was thwarted. Although what really attracted him was actually White's body. However, he was very clear that such a special talent would definitely be watched by many people. If there were too many people watching, it would be easy to reveal flaws. So he finally chose the most inconspicuous person besides Dake who was present at the time. Luoboat Broheim. He chose to live in a human body instead of finding a bat to be reborn. Apart from escaping and hiding, the biggest reason was that he understood the development of civilization and the changes of time during the battle with Dake and the others. In other words, he knew that he was outdated. So he wanted to learn. Learn the knowledge of the new era, accumulate new knowledge, and become strong again. Only in this way could the glory of the vampires shine on the earth. But after he parasitized Luoboat's body, he encountered unexpected difficulties. Because Luoboat didn't like to study, he couldn't even come into contact with books outside of textbooks. Helpless, he could only do some small actions. He let Luoboat feel the joy of learning by answering questions correctly in class. Little by little, he guided Luoboat to become a good student who actively obtained knowledge. For this, Vlad put an unimaginable effort. The final result was barely satisfactory. But in this month, Vlad still grasped some of the necessary knowledge for a first year. He even took advantage of when Luoboat was asleep to successfully refine a few magic cards, and hid them in the interlayer of his card bag. If he continued like this, although it wouldn't be too smooth, he would always be able to grasp more knowledge and gradually improve his magic engineering skills. There was an innate barrier between magic engineering and magic technology. The basic theory between the two contradicted each other. The more advanced a mage was, the more difficult it was to grasp magic engineering. But Vlad had already forgotten most of his memories. This instead became an advantage for him to receive a magic engineering education. He was very fascinated by magic engineering and wanted to learn more. However, the recent series of anomalies had left Vlad feeling that something was amiss. Especially yesterday's astronomy class and tonight's night. The sharp intuition that originated from the vampire bloodline made Vlad realize that he might have walked to the edge of the cliff where he would be exposed. He was already considering whether to give up Luobote's body and transfer into someone else's body at the cost of losing part of his soul to avoid detection. But after this idea came into his mind, he suddenly realized that his soul seemed to be incomplete to begin with. If he continued to split it, he might very well face the danger of collapse. At most, he would have to transfer again. Therefore, this time, he had to be very, very careful. Vlad observed for a long time. His target was the students of the House of Fools. The students of the House of Fools were low-key and inconspicuous. Even if he accidentally revealed a little of his own excellence in the future, it could be said that he had been well prepared. Look, this was so suitable for his identity. But before he had time to take action, tonight's encounter happened. The group of golems gave him the illusion that they were chasing and intercepting, as if someone was deliberately forcing him into a trap. He was aware of this. So at first he hid very well. Even Professor Kazair didn't sense his existence at all. Unfortunately, when it came to the end, he couldn't hide it. The moment Vlad summoned the blood bat, he had a premonition that he was very likely to be exposed. His premonition was correct. But the result seemed to be better than he imagined. Looking at the blonde boy who walked out from the group of golems, Vlad couldn't help but sneer. So you planned all of this? Yes, it was me. Dake folded his hands and answered very calmly. All the golems stopped moving after he appeared. Vlad's mouth curved into a smile, but his eyes were still gloomy. At first, he thought this was the plan of the Shungmalian Academy's professors. Those unfathomable professors were what he was most afraid of. But if it wasn't the professors who planned this, but the blonde boy in front of him, he would still be a little afraid, but not desperate. Do you think the current me is still the same as before? Vlad opened his mouth and lowered his voice in a Luobote voice. Dake was a little startled, but then he couldn't help but laugh. No way. You don't think the current me is still the same as before, do you? Both of them looked at each other. Vlad suddenly burst out laughing and took a step back. The dozen or so bloodbats, that were born from the self-destruction of the bloodbat, quickly gathered. One by one, they bared their sharp fangs and rushed forward. Dake glanced at those bloodbats and judged that they should be only one-star magic elves. So he moved his fingertips, and the magic card hidden in his hand quickly lit up. Hawkman Wrestling. Acha! The Hawkman Wrestling that rushed to join the battle showed its boiling fighting spirit. Its eyes narrowed, and it pounced on those bloodbats. Feather Dance. Following Dake's order, the Hawkman Wrestling used the midline of its body as the axis and spun rapidly in the air. Countless feathers shot out from its wings and pierced those ferocious bats. A few bats were pierced by the feathers and exploded in an instant, leaving only a drop of blood behind. That was Luobote's blood. A few other bats suddenly turned into light and merged with the blood light that shot from Vlad's direction, forming a terrifying summoning array that emitted a bloody aura. Sacrificial summoning. Dake's pupils shrank. Vlad had learned the sacrificial summoning. His magic card was refined by controlling Luobote. In a short moment of thinking, a ferocious-looking blood fiend rushed out from the sacrificial summoning array. The blood fiend was 2 meters tall, and its whole body was as red as flowing blood. Its overall appearance was like a tiger or leopard, and there was a tentacle with a long mouth on each side of its shoulders. The long tail behind its buttocks was like a huge snake waving in the air. Judging from the number of sacrificed bats, this blood fiend was at least 5-star. 5-star magic fairy. Even Dake had not refined half a blood fiend. How did Vlad, with his Luobote body, manage to refine it? Dake was surprised. But in reality, he was not flustered. When the blood fiend pounced, A white shadow suddenly jumped down from the sky. After landing on the ground, it took a few steps and suddenly jumped up. Accompanied by a sharp cat's cry, a cat's claw tore the blood fiend's face apart, and at the same time, it twisted and broke one of its tentacles. Roar! The blood fiend instantly let out a miserable cry. The stinky blood spurted out from the wound and splashed onto the Dilu beast's body. The somewhat misophobic Dilu beast furrowed its brows and fiercely glared at the screaming blood fiend. As the Dilu beast's eyes widened, a ray of light shot out from the amber cat's eyes like a spinning wheel, shooting into the blood fiend's eyes. The blood fiend, which had just been summoned and had not had time to swing its tail, felt dizzy. Under the influence of the cat's eyes, it fell into extreme confusion. If that's the only thing, Dake looked at Vlad curiously. Why didn't he cooperate with the blood fiend to attack? Even if he was only a parasite in Luoboat's body, he was now able to control Luoboat's body. It couldn't be because he didn't have enough magic power, right? Luoboat's magic power limit was indeed not high. It was far from enough to support Vlad to release that kind of red magic light in the secret passage. Without magic power, the vampire Vlad could not do anything with Luoboat's physical strength. But if he did not use magic and did not attack at close range, if he only relied on magic power, he would be a professional. But Vlad's laughter did not stop. After he sacrificed the blood fiend to summon it, he had already taken out the third magic card from the card pack. This was the result of his hard work for more than a month. The gathered blood will eventually become a sea of blood that gives birth to life. King of the night shrouded in darkness, awaken, vampire count. He slashed his left hand and let the blood drip down. Then he raised the magic card with his right hand. His expression gradually became crazed. The blood fiends that had fallen into a state of chaos actually exploded as he chanted. Bright red blood flowed all over the ground. It fused with the blood dripping from the bat. It reformed in the ancient castle, with the blood as the guide. The secret ritual card that was refined with Vlad's soul as the core shone in the air. The vampire that had split into countless clones and allowed Vlad to be reborn in the secret passage. The 8-star magic fairy that was once the hidden boss of the 8th floor during the Halloween event. The vampire count had finally reappeared in this world. This was the source of Vlad's confidence. Dake looked at the vampire count that Vlad had summoned. It looked somewhat similar to the vampire beast, and immediately recalled the scene during the Halloween event. It wasn't until this moment that he finally had a few guesses about Vlad's origins. For this reason he could not help but ask, Vlad, is this the reason why you were reborn? After successfully summoning the vampire count, the arrogance and confidence between Vlad's brows had resurfaced. He looked at Dake without the slightest bit of worry and sneered. What is the truth of this matter? How can a human with their shallow intelligence understand it? Dake. You mean you don't know either? A trace of anger flashed through Vlad's eyes. Die, you mongrel cultivator. Blood is power. The vampire count roared in response. The crimson cloak that was condensed from the blood on its body fluttered, even though there was no wind, and its entire body floated into the air. Boiling blood gushed out from its open hands, continuously rushing to its feet and head, gradually condensing into 2 tumbling seas of blood. One after another, ferocious and terrifying blood fiends poked their heads out of the tumbling seas of blood. They tore at each other and roared angrily. Their roars resounded throughout the castle. Dake had seen this scene during the Halloween event. The vampire count in front of him was a summoner-type character, and its main method of fighting was to summon endless blood fiends from the Sea of Blood. As for itself, other than being able to borrow the power of the Sea of Blood to revive infinitely, it did not display any offensive or defensive abilities that matched an 8-star. Perhaps it did not possess such abilities. Or perhaps it did not display them. After all, it was a one-time summon boss, so it was possible that its strength was limited by shackles. However, the scale of the Sea of Blood of this vampire count was far inferior to the hidden boss from before. This was probably related to the fact that there was no blood altar under its feet. Dake narrowed his eyes slightly, and his fingers that were hidden in his sleeves picked up the second magic card. Fusion? At that moment, a black cat quickly ran over and met up with the Diru beast that was stained with blood and had a painful expression on its face. It was the Diru beast that Dake had already summoned and evolved before he appeared. The battle with the vampire Vlad had not been a careless one. Dake had already made precise calculations, as a large amount of magic power was injected into fusion. The black and white fish on the card shook their tails and swam out of the card. They drilled out of his sleeves and grew with the wind. Sensing the call of fusion, the Diru beast and the Diru beast raised their heads at the same time. After the black and white fish grew to more than 2 meters long, they flew toward the two magic elves that represented darkness and light respectively. The black fish circled around the Diru beast, while the white fish stuck to the Diru beast's body. The two magic elves turned into black and white light under the circling of the black and white fish, and they converged together like a spiral. A huge and mysterious magic array suddenly unfolded in the air. Then the magic elven that was based on the Egyptian cat god once again danced out of the magic array. Moving cat ears, two cat tails that people could not help but want to grab, coupled with soft orange hair, a delicate face, a slender waist like a cat, and a soft and beautiful body. It was like a walking book that people could not help but be intoxicated by. Coupled with pearls, gems, and golden rings all over its body, it was as if it was full of wealth. Money and wealth, women and beauty. A magic elven that gathered two fatal factors. This was the Basti beast, the cat goddess, a 7-star Basti beast and an 8-star vampire count. Who is the king that controls blood? The corner of Dake's mouth curled up, and his eyes were filled with anticipation. However, he still hid paradise as his last resort. The origin of the Basti beast was the little demon beast and the Diru beast. After they fused and evolved, they still belonged to paradise. But after the two merged, they could only be counted as one entity. Therefore, if paradise was activated, the magic attack and defense of the Basti beast would instantly increase by 900. In this form, the Basti beast could even fight a 9-star magic elven, let alone a mere 8-star magic elven. But if he did that directly, wouldn't it make Vlad feel despair? That wouldn't do. No matter what, he had to show that they were evenly matched. Basti beast, I'll leave the rest to you. It shouldn't be a problem, right? Dake looked at the sensitive back of the Basti beast and said slowly, "Meow." The Basti beast turned its head and winked at him. Then it walked forward with its cat-like steps. At that moment, Vlad's expression had changed slightly, but the vampire count was still roaring. When the sea of blood formed, a large group of blood fiends immediately leaped out, roaring crazily as they charged toward the Basti beast. Every blood fiend was more ferocious than the 5-star blood fiends from before. They seemed to be endless as they pounced out of the sea of blood, forming a terrifying blood tide. However, after the Basti beast walked to a certain distance, it gently stopped and stretched out its hand. The blood fiend that was leading the charge instantly lost its form when it came into contact with its fingertip, turning into the most primordial blood. The corner of the Basti beast's mouth curled up, and she softly chanted, "Vampires dance." The blood clump floating on her fingertip was instantly absorbed by her, and turned into a purer power of darkness. The blood fiends that pounced over were ferocious and terrifying. But in front of the cat goddess, they were just rations that could be sucked at will. The Basti beast chuckled, and a bloody light flickered in her charming eyes. She actually went against the flow of the blood fiends and walked leisurely. The blood fiends that passed by her naturally turned into blood. Like the streamers of dancers, they were sucked to her and slowly flowed around her. It was especially gorgeous. 4-in-1 8,000 plus. I don't remember how many days I've updated a day this month. In short, give me some free tickets and things like that. In the reality of the plummeting subscriptions, give me some motivation to keep on updating. Chapter 320. Vampires dance. While dancing, it approaches the opponent and sucks away every drop of blood in the opponent's body. The more beautiful the dance, the more deadly it was. The Basti beast's control over blood was obviously stronger than the vampire counts. And it wasn't just a little bit stronger. What was the reason for this? Although Dake had some guesses, he couldn't be sure. But in any case, the strong was the strong. and the weak was the weak. The Basti beast danced gracefully in the midst of the blood tide. Even Vlad couldn't help but be moved by its gorgeous movements. Vlad had parasitized Luo Boat's body, and had seen the Basti beast's elegance in the newcomer competition. But that time, the Basti beast had only appeared briefly, and the competition had ended without even using a surekill skill. But this time, he felt the natural charm of the opposite sex at close range, and his whole body became slightly hot. The Basti beast seemed to have an unusual attraction to vampires. Remember, https://mvip can't you? VIP Vlad quietly swallowed a mouthful of saliva, so that he wouldn't show any embarrassment in this duel. For this reason he raised his spirits and coldly said to the vampire count, "Bloom blood flower. Feel death." The vampire count roared in response. He suddenly stretched out his right arm, and his pale fingers with sharp nails pinched hard. Bang! A blood fiend that was close to the Basti beast, and was about to turn into blood suddenly exploded. The blood flower petals that exploded from the inside out were enchanting and dazzling. Then, bang, bang, bang! Countless blood fiends that were rushing toward the Basti beast exploded one after another. The entire passage was like a flower bed where blood flowers bloomed, and the smell of blood filled the space. The Basti beast that was walking in the blood tide was actually submerged in the gorgeous blood flower petals. A 7-star magic guide fairy dares to compete with an 8-star magic guide fairy? Vlad's voice became high-spirited again. The vampire count responded to his command and kept summoning blood fiends from the sea of blood above and below to charge and self-explode, making the blood flower bloom even more fiercely. In the blink of an eye, his field of vision was completely submerged in blood. From Dake's perspective, he couldn't even see the shadow of the Basti beast. But he was not anxious at all. The fusion card that carried the Basti beast in his hand was still emitting a faint golden halo, and was unusually stable. Although the Basti beast's mana was lost in the explosion, it was restored to full in an instant. Vlad's arrogance was built on ignorance. Stars were equivalent to levels, but the status of a magic guide fairy was determined by its user. The Basti beast was a magical elf with divinity. Although it was not a true god card, it could be distinguished from magical elves that were below the gods. If it was placed among the vampires, it would be equivalent to the true ancestor. If the vampire count had abandoned the power of the blood sea and fought the enemy with his claws and fangs, he might have been more of a threat to Batai. There was a gap in their knowledge reserves, so what they saw was naturally different. However, the truth was right in front of his eyes. Even the stupidest person would be able to tell. The whole explosion lasted for a very long time. The vampire count's blood sea was about to dry up before it stopped under Vlad's command. However, as the blood splattered, the Basti beast's graceful body was revealed in front of everyone without a single speck of dust. It looked at Vlad, who was shocked because of this, with a playful gaze. Then, with a flick of its finger, a dark red stream of blood drilled out from its fingertip. It was more than 10 meters long with the wind, and turned into a terrifying blood dragon as thick as a bucket. The blood of the blood dragon came from the blood fiends. After the Basti beast absorbed the vampire count's power, it transformed into a blood dragon with fresh blood as its body and the power of darkness as its core. The newly born blood dragon immediately let out a soundless but terrifying roar at Vlad. Vlad's originally condescending gaze suddenly became fierce and restrained. His face turned cold, and he suddenly shouted, "Vampire Count!" When the vampire count heard this, his originally arrogant and indifferent face suddenly became furious. An endless blood light surged all over his body. The sea of blood under his feet, and above his head actually flowed to his raised right hand under his control. An extremely long blood-red scythe was thus forged. Death Harvest. The vampire count let out a roar. He actually raised the blood scythe high and pounced on the Basti beast. In the end, it still turned into a hand-to-hand battle. The Basti beast pursed her lips and smiled. She raised her right hand like a leopard's claw, and put her blood-stained index finger into the veil. She licked it with her tongue, and there was a seductive look in her eyes. The blood dragon coiled above her head leaned down and charged toward the vampire count. The vampire count raised the blood scythe high and slashed at the dragon's head without fear. The blood dragon suddenly opened its bloody mouth and bit at the blood scythe. Boom! The scythe's mouth. The dragon's teeth bit down. The blood scythe tried to cut the blood dragon, but the blood dragon bit the blade of the scythe. But after a moment of stalemate, the vampire count, who suddenly exerted his strength, broke through the dragon's teeth's clamp and slashed down, cutting off the dragon's blood from the corner of its mouth to its lower jaw. Roar! The vampire count, who finally achieved a little success, immediately let out a roar as if he was venting his anger. Vlad also laughed and said, "It's just a formality." At the same time, the vampire count had already broken the blood dragon into more than a dozen pieces. However, Vlad was right about one thing. The blood dragon was indeed just a formality. The Basti beast bent her finger, and the blood dragon that had been cut into more than a dozen pieces grew a head and a tail respectively, turning into more than a dozen smaller blood dragons. Then they bit the vampire count's body from multiple directions. While these more than a dozen blood dragons were biting, they also turned their bodies into shackles, tightly binding the vampire count. One of them even climbed up his right arm that was holding the scythe, pulling off his right arm and binding it tightly. The more than a dozen blood dragons exerted force again, and the vampire count's scream rang out. Meow! Only then did the Basti beast walk in front of the vampire count with a smile. Then she tiptoed slightly and raised her head slightly. Her beautiful face met the vampire count's eyes. Then she raised her hand and pierced the vampire count's forehead with her sharp nails. The fingertip pierced through the pale and stiff skin, and a drop of blood actually flowed out. As soon as the drop of blood flowed out, it was sucked into the Basti beast's fingertip. She smiled sweetly and seductively. She exerted more force with her fingertip and pierced the vampire count's forehead. The vampire's blood immediately rolled out. Vlad probably didn't expect that the 8-star magic elf that he had paid a great price to refine, the vampire count, would actually lose to a 7-star magic elf. When the vampire count's blood was sucked clean by the Basti beast, and he gradually became skin and bones, Vlad realized that he had lost the battle. He was more or less the type who could bend and stand tall. He was a coward when he should be. He was a coward when he should be. At this moment he made a prompt decision. He didn't even have time to adjust his expression. After saying those harsh words, he suddenly fled backward. The light cavalry that was blocking that side just now stopped by the wall because of Dake's arrival, leaving a way for him to escape. In the process of fleeing, Vlad didn't forget to light up the last magic card. He threw the magic card that was suffused with a bloody light behind him, and a huge number of bats flew out from the card's surface in an endless stream. Then, like a swarm of bees, they pounced on the Basti beast and Dake. They looked just like real bats. But in fact, they were just a group of phantoms. They densely covered the entire passageway. Vlad's figure disappeared from Dark's eyes. But he immediately shouted, "Basti beast, catch him!" Meow. Basti let out a meow and casually tossed the vampire count who had been sucked dry to the side. Then he exerted force with his feet and leaped onto the wall. Borrowing the momentum, he pounced forward and closed the distance between himself and Vlad. Vlad didn't need to turn his head to feel the approaching magic fairy. His expression was panicked, but his eyes were flashing with a fierce light. With Luoboat's body, he couldn't exert any strength at all. If he was caught, he could almost imagine the miserable fate of being killed. But what was more terrifying was far from death. When Vlad parasitized Luoboat's body, he already had a basic understanding of the intelligence of this era. He knew very well that he was very likely to be the last vampire. And in this Shungmalian academy, there were indeed a few professors who were addicted to research. If he fell into the hands of those professors, it would be hard for him to die even if he wanted to. As demons, vampires were like fish on a chopping board in the eyes of some humans. Dissecting and researching them didn't have any psychological burden. So he couldn't be caught, even if he died. At this moment, the pride that had taken root in the depths of his soul had already risen. Vlad would rather die than become a fish on a chopping board. But it's still okay. He couldn't help but touch his chest, and forced a sinister smile on his panicked face. There's still one to accompany me to the grave. 1 for 1, not a loss. But just as Vlad had made up his mind to take the enemy down with him, a ray of hope shone into his eyes. His best friend, White Gouda, suddenly rushed out from around the corner. At first, Vlad thought that White Gouda was also a part of the group that had surrounded him. But then he suddenly realized that if White wanted to make a move on him, he didn't have to go through so much trouble. The two were almost inseparable. If White had known that he was parasitized in Luoboat's body, he would probably have been surrounded by those unfathomable professors. But since he didn't, Vlad's eyes flashed with a strange light, and the bloody light in his eyes quickly hid in the depths of his eyes. White, run. He rushed forward and grabbed White, who was gradually slowing down. Ha. White gasped for breath and hurriedly asked, Luoboat, why are you here? I've been discovered by the golems. Vlad rushed to the other side of the corner and hurriedly shouted, I've been discovered by the golems too. Not only the golems, but also the bats. Bats? Where did the bats come from? White looked sideways and saw a swarm of bats blocking his vision. Vlad hurriedly said, How would I know? Just run a little faster. I don't want to be locked up again. But in a place where White couldn't see, Vlad raised his left hand slightly and bent his 5 fingers into a claw. There was a bloody aura lingering around the claw, and it was filled with a threatening aura. Obviously, after obtaining a new hostage, he had more confidence. Luoboat was a worthless person in his eyes, and he didn't even deserve to be used as a hostage. But his best friend White was the son of a hero, and was definitely a high-quality hostage. In fact, he quickly realized that the 7-star magical elf didn't chase after him. This made him immediately realize that his idea was completely correct. With the White Gouda in his hands, even the golden-haired youth would stop out of fear. After that, he only needed to. A trace of extreme greed suddenly flashed in Vlad's eyes. He had been enduring for a long time. The White Gouda was the most delicious food for a vampire with a normal sexual orientation. But in order to study hard and improve every day, he had been enduring. Now that his parasitism had been discovered, he finally didn't have to endure anymore. First, transfer his soul to the White Gouda, and completely take over its body. Then, suck Luoboat's blood clean, and replenish his energy, to absorb and digest the uniqueness of the White Gouda's body. Once the digestion was successful, he might be able to recover to his peak state, and even become stronger. At that time, he would have the power to break the barrier and escape from the academy. But it was a pity that his path to knowledge would be cut off because of this. In this extremely short period of time, Vlad had already thought of a follow-up. He felt as if he had escaped from a dangerous situation. Even when he ran forward hand in hand with White, it was as if there was a background music of, I am the wind, you are the sand playing. The two turned and turned in the castle's passageways, and with their rich experience, they finally shook off the magic golem's pursuit. Vlad pulled White into a classroom, and panted heavily. We finally shook them off. Are you all right, White? I'm fine. White's mouth flashed with a hint of green light, and said while supporting herself on her knees. After a while he asked in confusion, Luoboat, why are you outside? Vlad's mouth curved into a smile. I was curious, so I followed you out. How was it? A trace of embarrassment appeared on White's face and she lamented. Didn't you see? I was discovered by the magic golems as soon as I crossed the bridge. I managed to escape with great difficulty, but they told me. Vlad revealed a look of curiosity. Told you what? White. She said she lost a game of truth or dare, and was forced to give me the chocolate. They were too much, and they even bet behind my back whether I would be asked out or not. Vlad couldn't help but reveal a look of astonishment, and he suddenly felt pity for this close friend of his. 2-in-1 4,000 plus. The cold weather caused the pipes to leak, and it took a whole day. The next 2-in-1 might be after 12 o'clock, but it will definitely happen. In short, overcome everything, and persevere is victory. Currently, the bounty has accumulated to 139 chapters, 2,000 words/chapter. As of 4:45 p.m. on January 1st of this year, 77 chapters have been released, and 62 chapters are left. There are 50 chapters planned for this month, and they are expected to be paid off before the Spring Festival. Good luck! That you're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.